Huawei's been recovering. Huawei itself, not Honor, but Huawei itself's been recovering lots of market share within China.
Yeah, so I think the 2023 performance that was 17% growth at the consumer business was quite back-ended, I think, as an analyst.
Towards the end of 23.
So you remember they came out with this thing in September called Mate 60 Pro. That
a suspiciously good chip.
US hawks were horrified by it because people did teardowns and there are chips in there that they shouldn't have been able to get access to.
7 nanometer process. Yeah.
And we don't really want to go into all of that.
We've done it exhaustively,
loads of times. But anyway, however they did it, whatever the explanation is,
they didn't stop you getting into it in your story. I noticed.
A little bit, yeah, but they
bit of ASML, bit of EUV.
However they've done it, they're now in Omdia's table, which came out this week. The handset makers, like you were saying, they're ninth, I think, in that. You know, they grew their shipments by more than any company in the top 10.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast on this very cold and shitty day in London. This being the Friday when we record it.
It's really horrible.
I was just saying to our colleague Teresa, you know, I bet in Czech Republic when it's winter, at least you get proper snow and all the sort of romance and cuteness that comes with snow. We just get freezing rain.
Yeah.
It's going to be like this for the foreseeable future as well.
Yeah. Well, it is only early February, I guess.
The next 10 days.
Next 10 days of shite.
Yeah.
Fucking Barcelona better be nice.
February's like the worst month. I mean, I prefer it to January because it's relatively short at least. And
January
at the end of winter, aren't you?
Yeah. January's just like that.
January's like a hangover.
Well, exactly, because you've just had a laugh for all of December. You don't care about the weather because you're off your tits the whole month. And then January comes along, and in my case, you get all austere and monastic.
Yeah. You sit at the pub looking at your colleague.
And it's 31 days, and you got paid on the 20th, and you blew it all on fucking brandy butter. And now you got to get through the cold and this long month and all that sort of thing. It's a sort of ordeal. It's a test of personality, January, I think. Yeah. And we come through it stronger, I like to think.
You get a seasonal, what's it called? SAD?
Yeah, seasonal something disorder. Seasonal affective disorder?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that a thing?
Which seems like a really overly medical way of saying people who don't like being cold and short days.
Affective.
Seasonal affective.
So I don't really like New Year because you've got January right around the corner.
Right, and you can't get past that.
No.
You can't just have a laugh.
No, because the next day is the start of January.
That's a really shitty outlook to let it ruin your day just because of something coming up.
Yeah, well.
I mean, you could just say, well, what's the point in doing anything? You're going to die eventually.
Maybe that explains why I am the way I am.
Your Eeyore-ish attitude.
Fatalist.
So there's that. And or maybe it's because you are a bit hungover and tired, Ian.
Could be.
Why are you hungover and tired?
I was out having some larks yesterday. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's a very professional lunchtime meeting, of course, with people from Huawei.
Ben and Hazel,
who are the sort of PR representatives for Huawei UK. Yeah. So,
I tell you, this is no criticism of Ben or Hazel, but given the amount of news they are asked to pass on to us, apart from getting us pissed, you have to wonder what they get up to.
Mm. Yeah, well, it was very nice anyway. We went to this restaurant on the Cut called Flatiron, which does really nice steaks, and had a couple of bottles of wine. And so thank you very much to Ben and Hazel,
Cheers. And then
good to catch up with them. I haven't seen them since December.
And then you powered through and had some more pintage with Hazel, and then you went home and had 2 bottles of wine. Is that right?
Yeah.
God damn, boy.
It's not as though I've got a job to do or anything.
Yeah.
So.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I'm going to be seeing them too. So looking forward to that.
Coincided with Huawei's results coming out.
Well, indeed, which is okay. So that's a good way. Actually, I don't have any other opening bollocks to talk about, as I haven't been out and about since last week. We were going to have a guest this week, but they bailed. So
I thought you banned them.
No, they were welcome. They were people who were trying to be a bit high maintenance about like seeing it before it went out, so that they could edit it. And I was like, nah. That's not how this works. And then they're like, all right, sorry about that. Yeah, we agree to your terms. Like they got any fucking choice.
Yeah.
And then they just bailed anyway. So there we are. So that's why it's just us.
So what are we going to talk about today, apart from Huawei?
So yeah, we can talk about Huawei. I mean, the results came out, but it's not
really results.
I mean, it's basically they're their rotating chairman managed to get over his dizziness long enough to go and do a little speech.
Is he one of the rotating chairmen, or is he sort of on a different level from the rotating?
No,
bosses?
I actually looked it up on their website. So they got 4.
I fudged it.
They got 4 in the rotation. They got this geezer. What's his name?
Liang's his first
Yeah.
name. Well, it might even be his. I don't know how.
I know. I get confused over
this.
Chinese, Japanese, Korean. I get confused over what's the first name. What's
because
the
people
name.
were like the founder Ren Shengfei. People would say Ren, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
If you refer to him in a sentence, instead
Or
of
they
saying
might say
Kuching,
Mr. Ren.
Mr. Ren.
Like
exactly.
sometimes when I'm hanging out with Chinese people, they call me Mr. Scott.
Yes.
Which, in one sense, I want to go, nah, don't worry about that. But then in another sense, it makes me feel a bit imperious.
Mm.
And of course, my first name is a surname as well.
Yes,
but there we are.
Confusing.
Wait,
maybe they just don't want to get their head around my weird fucking surname.
No, they probably can't pronounce your surname.
No,
most people can't.
We should return the favour. You know how Chinese people pick an English name?
Yeah,
we should pick a Chinese name. Make
it
easier for them.
We won't be able to say it.
Let alone write it.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to learn Chinese calligraphy.
My name will just look like a 5-year-old drawing a house. Anyway, he's called Liang Hua, sorry. And yeah, I mean, last we saw it was Meng Wanzhou, who's Ren's daughter, who's the one who was kidnapped by the Canadians for a couple of years.
Kidnapped by the Canadians.
That's more or less what happened, wasn't it?
Yeah. I guess so.
And she was doing, when we spoke about it in our first pod of the year, when we had to do remotely, she was the chair then, and so maybe the rotation happens halfway through January. But I had to look up. There's 4 of them in the rotation.
Chinese New Year, isn't it?
Oh, well, maybe there we go. Do we know the date of Chinese New Year?
It's right now,
as we speak.
Well, it goes on for a few days, and we're in the middle of it. It finishes on the 12th of February.
So maybe this is it. Maybe this Liang Hua. Maybe that was his first speech. Public speech as the new rotating chair. But the rotation is just 4 people.
Yeah.
So it's not, I mean, they don't seem to get any new talent in.
No. Well, there was, so...
Maybe they have to wait for someone to die.
If you read Eva Du's book on how all that got set up, I think it sort of it took shape because Ren was unsure about his successor.
Right.
And there was speculation for a long time that one of these guys would eventually become the actual CEO, someone like Eric. Is it Eric Xu?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's another one in the rotation.
Ken Hu is one.
There we are.
Those are the other 2, basically. We named all 4 of them now.
Yeah, that's right, all 4.
That one of them would maybe ascend to the permanent role and kind of take over from Ren. But 2 things have happened. I think he's kind of carried on exercising ultimate control, hasn't he, Ren Xingfei? Even though he's quite old now. Well, he has. I mean, he pretty much took over during the whole crisis period. He was the one doing all the interviews and.
During the crisis period, it was. But I mean, you say that with greater confidence than I think I can say about how Huawei works.
Well, that's
quite opaque.
That's one thing I think you take away from the Eva Du book. Where
fair enough. Which I haven't read, so I'll defer to you.
And there's obviously she's met him and interviewed him, and he's very much a sort of active figure within the management of the company, much more so than it appears from the outside, where you think, it's all Ken Hu's handling.
Is it like in Iran where they have the prime minister, but it's basically just some Ayatollah in the background?
I don't really want to compare him to the Ayatollah Khomeini.
No, I don't mean that as a literal comparison. In case you offended Huawei people.
But
no, I was just trying to think of that was just the first thing that came to mind of a thing where you've got the nominal people in charge, but then everyone knows that there's
maybe. I mean, he's
shadowy puppet master.
Rotating bosses do have a lot of power.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It's not like they're not doing anything. So, but he's very much there. And then I think there was then speculation about Meng taking over as the company boss, for a long time.
Well, actually, I just fired up Huawei's executives page on their website.
Right.
So it's got the rotating people, and it's got you see, this time, that's so confusing. It's how did I write it? Hold on. Liang Hua. Yeah. Sorry, I thought I got it wrong in my writing. So we got Liang Hua as the current chairman, and then we got the other 3 that we've just mentioned. And then we got a bunch of other execs. And then on the 3rd row, we've got Ren Shangfei, who's director, CEO. So I suppose it's counterintuitive. We think of a chairperson as more in the background, puppet master type of thing.
Yeah.
And then the CEOs as the executive, as the name strongly implies.
Yeah.
They seem to do it the other way around.
They
The
do.
CEOs, that the behind the scenes super head honcho.
Totally, yeah.
So there we are. I don't know, some of the people don't have English names. Some of them do. I guess it's just whether you fancy it or not. So there we are. I'm not going to butcher any more Chinese names today.
No.
So he went and had a.
You went to some business forum or something.
Yeah,
in Guangzhou.
Guangzhou, and had a little chat, and then he let out just one data point.
He blurted it out.
Yeah, why don't I hand over to you? You can take it from there, mate.
Yeah, so the one data point that he blurted out, although I don't think it was very, very intentional, obviously. Normally they do this sort of stuff, by the way, in the New Year's message. Our New Year's message.
Yeah.
So
normally it would have been Meng doing
Meng would. So they write this letter that's full of sort of poetry and Confucian philosophy and all this stuff.
Yeah, and
then there's a mention of revenue.
One swallow doesn't make a summer and
all this
that
stuff.
sort of thing.
Hers was about lanterns shining in
there we are.
starless skies and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And anyway, she for the first time I can remember, she didn't include any mention of sales.
That's right. Yeah.
At all, and it was quite bland. I thought her New Year's message. I mean, no sort of criticism of her.
Yeah.
Because I don't really know her.
Well, there was enough in it for me to write a story. Just because she was going.
It was like reading a book of use cases, of 5G use cases.
Yes, there was a lot of that, and there's a bit of criminology that goes on with this stuff where you're trying to read between the lines, and because to generalise massively, I get the impression that a lot of Chinese sort of public communication is done in a slightly coded, understated way.
Yeah,
they're like the opposite of someone like Donald Trump or Elon Musk, who just come out and blurt shit and swear and stuff.
Yeah.
So they like to be understated. So it's left to the person reading it to kind of try and read between the lines. And I'm always looking for signs of defiance of them just going,
yeah, totally
going up yours, America.
But there was a little bit of that, I think, when she picked up on to do with the academia.
Yeah, that was the strongest angle of actually substantial stuff.
Yeah, and most of the rest of it were quite kind of bland use cases about 5G being used in mines and things like that. And, and it went on and on and on with these different examples. And I just thought, whereas I think when they've been done in the past by Eric Xu or whoever, it's been a page with the revenue figure and then something about the supply chain or whatever.
Well, often what they lack in substance, they make up in length.
Yeah, so it wasn't great, to be honest.
No.
And instead of revealing it then, it's been revealed at this business forum in Guangzhou. And I think it's interesting in a way that they've done it that way round. I mean, I think one small takeaway maybe, I think this is a bigger trend that's happening with Huawei, that we're never ever going to see Huawei being as open.
No.
And as
they're not even a publicly traded company.
But
even on Chinese stock exchanges.
They obviously do their annual report still, but we had a lot of engagement with Huawei over the kind of 2019 to 2022, 2021, 2022 period, when they were obviously fighting fires and they were trying to kind of convince the West that they weren't a threat, that they weren't closely affiliated with the Chinese government, that they didn't have dodgy software. They were trying to sort of put their strategy across in terms of how they were coping with sanctions. And the impression I get from sources is that they don't feel that it paid off, basically. That all this kind of PR engagement that they had with the industry and with the Western press didn't really get them anywhere. It didn't elicit any sympathy for them in EU political circles. And this is what
I think that could be slightly nuanced. So like in the UK...
This is what they think.
Right, okay, fair enough, carry on.
So they... their view on it now is that there's not really a lot of point in doing that. Look where it got us. And I think they're just going to hunker down. And the sad thing is for journalists like us, where we actually had better access to them, I would say, a few years ago, is that we'll find out less and less about them now. And especially with the guy that you've got in the White House at the moment, they'll just want people to know less about what they're doing, I think.
Yeah.
And we might talk a bit about this, but let me just send the chips.
Let me steer it back, because we will go in that direction. But we keep teasing this data point. But we haven't actually said what the fucking data point is.
I think it's 860 billion Chinese. I can't pronounce that. Is it
renminbi?
Yeah, but there's another word, isn't there, as well, that begins with Y.
Yuan.
Yeah.
Yuan. Yeah, and what's the difference? Is it like a difference between pounds and sterling or something? I get confused.
I don't know. But is it 860 billion?
RMB.
And it's 22% growth.
That's right.
On the figure.
860, yep, spot on. Yep. And that is 22% up on last year.
On last year. It also happens to be the highest rate of growth since 2016. and from quite a substantial amount of money as well that they were reporting in 2023. So it's
Well, I've actually got the data table going back to 2019 that I screenshot for last year's story about their
in
numbers.
my story, I've got a wonderful chart. You'll notice
Have you?
if
Let's
you
have a
want
look.
to open it up, and it looks like
There it is.
yeah,
It is wonderful.
it's pretty simple.
So basically, what's happened? Looking at Ian's chart, where he's bothered to actually make a chart out of the data table that I just screenshot off Huawei. We've had gradual growth. So Ian's chart covers 9 years. We've had gradual growth from 2015 going up to 2020, and then it fell off, and now that pattern's kind of reasserted itself for gradual growth.
It's like the same thing happening again.
Yeah,
It's like,
exactly.
like you sort of reset the clock and start growing again. Basically.
Although, to be fair, I mean, even their 2021, which was their big drop-off year, that was still only down to about 2017 levels, wasn't it?
Yeah. It wiped out a few years' progress, didn't it?
Basically, that's what it is. It sort of set it back about, let's say, 4 years for the sake of argument.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the I noticed by the time I got around to writing it, you did your coverage yesterday, and I think you were probably fairly quick on it. But by the time I got around to writing it, CNBC and obviously everyone are over this. And one of the takeaways seems to be, look, sanctions haven't worked, and they're still really strong. And I think some of our former colleagues, I think Telecom.com might have gone with that angle and all this as well. And
I heard on a pod the other day, I heard a really good quote where someone defined journalism as the struggle of facts against narrative.
Right.
And this is definitely how I feel, because we're all susceptible to narrative, because in the case of journalism, it's basically things that confirm your priors, that confirm your biases and your assumptions. And so obviously an easy and fun journalistic narrative is America's throwing its weight around, it's not working, ha, ha, ha.
Yeah.
And I find myself seduced by that when something like this happens. But then as soon as I know that I'm leaning into a narrative, I try and fight it.
Yeah.
Not necessarily to come to a different conclusion, but at least to interrogate my instincts and my tendencies.
You're contrarian, Scott.
Yeah, even to myself.
Yeah, it's a bit more nuanced, I think, than some of the assumptions.
Yeah, well, and also let's look at, which we will get into, I'm sure, let's look at how, if they are managing to succeed in spite of the US. And we agree that if we were to extrapolate their trajectory leading up to 2020, they'd still be better off now than if the US hadn't done anything.
Well, there was one quote that he sort of Reuters got hold of, which they got by way of, I think, the Shenzhen Business Post or whatever it's called or something.
Yeah, well, that's where the original thing came.
And there was one 3-4 line long quote that he sort of came out with when he was citing the figure 860 billion. And they're really revealing those quotes, I think, because there's the clues as to where the performance came from.
Yeah.
And if you read that, I think it says something like ICT being stable. They always talk about will, like it's in the future, but it's basically last year's results.
Right.
But they talk about ICT being... ICT is their networks business plus some other stuff, I think, these days, which they talk about as stable, i.e. flat, is my read into that. And then there's a mention of the consumer business that's growing.
Yeah.
And there's a mention of automotive that's rapidly growing.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at what happened in 2023, it's and you sort of say, well, let's assume that the same patterns are kind of continuing. ICT grew by 2.3%, which isn't surprising because it's like a mature market. The 5G, we're in a not mature market, but we're in that kind
cycle.
Of we're in that downward bit of the cycle.
Yeah, most of the capex to do with 5G has been done.
I mean, I looked up, when I was writing my piece, I did look up what's going on in China with China Mobile, which is the biggest 5G operator there. And obviously Huawei's one consequence, I think, of geopolitics is Huawei's become more dependent on Chinese revenue, Chinese business.
Oh, 100%.
It's domestic
massively,
market.
I think.
Much more so, yeah.
I don't think, I bet you it stopped doing it. It used to break out its stuff by geography.
I think it still does. I think
Okay,
it just shows that
be
it's
instructive.
like 2/3 China or something.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not quite that high, but if you look at the big Chinese operators, and there's always been this sort of feeling that Huawei's okay without the West because China's such a huge market. With
which is partly true.
It's partly true, but those operators are cutting capex as well. It's not just a US phenomenon. This downturn in spending. China Mobile, I think, was talking about spending something like they haven't published their full year figures yet, but they spent something like 12 billion. They actually call out what they're spending on 5G in their presentations. they're really revealing, by the way. China Mobile, very detailed breakdown of numbers for a Chinese
we
state-backed.
generally consider the whole country to be quite opaque.
It's there's the auditing questions and all that, but it's still a lot of information.
Which I made a few nods to in my story.
No, that's what Ben was actually reading your thing and laughing about it over lunch. He quite enjoyed all of that and the little.
Don't get Ben in the shit.
The little crossings out.
Yeah. So I'll tell people what I did there. We like to have a bit of fun. And this.
Am I going to get Ben in the shit for that now?
No. I'm only joking. I'm just saying that he laughed at it, but I'm sure he's not so closely monitored as that.
No.
It's what was it? It was my second paragraph. I said, Huawei. Oh God, there's a typo. I'm always doing.
I didn't notice your typo because I read it and I didn't notice your typo.
Okay, see if you can detect it now. While Huawei rarely accused of financial transparency.
He's really accused. Yeah, right.
So there's an ears missing.
Yeah.
This was still an odd way to make such an important data point public. Sometimes we get a preview in the New Year speech, which we've just gone over, but it usually takes Huawei a few months to make sure its public accounts are fully audited. And before fully audited, I wrote meet expectations and then did the strike through thing. And this isn't, I'm not necessarily suggesting that any impropriety or anything like that, but it's not a public company.
No.
So it doesn't have the same incentives to be totally transparent and totally auditable.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, completely.
That's all.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't surprise me if when they sit down and they speak to their accountants, and they probably do have auditors, where they go, that number, it's not quite what we hoped it would be.
Yeah.
And they have a little chat like that. I don't know. That's just my bigoted assumption.
I mean, there is a lot of detail in the Huawei accounts as well, actually, more than people give them credit for, I think. It's not maybe broken out to the degree that you'd find with Ericsson and Nokia, but the China Mobile stuff really is broken out to the level where they say what they're spending CapEx on. And they spent something like 12 billion on 5G rollout in 2023. 12 billion on 5G. I mean, it shows that like China's big, obviously, and a lot of money goes into. I mean, 12 billion is like basically half of Verizon's capex.
Well, and let's not downplay how technologically advanced China is.
Yeah, and the other thing is that 12 billion, who's like these US deals, they get split 50-50, let's say, between two Western vendors, or maybe there's three in the mix. I mean, that's like, I don't know, I'm speculating, but it's what, 70-30 Huawei ZTE these days, probably, something like that.
I think that's about right. I think last time I looked at it was about, I think they had about 2/3 Huawei, about 30% ZTE, and then a bit of token Ericsson, just to say they're not.
Yeah, although I did hear someone make the comment that Ericsson's China business is actually bigger than what it makes in Sweden. Because even with 1 or 2%,
even with 1%,
you're looking at a huge amount.
Well, that's it. It's a huge market, and it's a technologically advanced market.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at a country of equivalent size and population, India. It's got a lower GDP per capita, and it's less technologically advanced, at least when it comes to infrastructure.
Yeah. So China Mobile's figure 12 billion in 2023. Then last year they said they were expecting to spend about 9, I think. It might not have dropped off quite that much, but it's quite a big drop off in terms of capex spending. A good chunk of change, but this explains why you would expect those 5G, the ICT business as they call it now, to be quite flat. Or either a tiny bit of growth or a small decline. It would be odd if they were doing something very, very different from Ericsson and Nokia. Ericsson and Nokia's results, by the way, for the full year are not very good, really, in terms of sales.
I wrote it in my story, and I hope I got the numbers right and did the currency calculations right. But so the 860 RMB is equivalent to about $118 billion.
Yeah,
and assuming my calculations are correct, I said Ericsson brought in about 23 billion last year and Nokia about 20 billion.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Right, so it's about a fifth, less than a fifth.
It is, and then if you look at where it went, I think Ericsson's sales are down 6% reported, and I think Nokia was down about 9%.
Yeah, and theirs are up 22.
Now, there's a few moving parts in there, but they're mainly network companies. You pointed this out as well. They don't do the handset stuff, obviously, anymore, which is a massive driver for Huawei. And then, just going back to a continuation of these trends and given what Liang said in that short statement he made, I think the consumer business was really on a roll in 2023. 2023 it did pretty well compared to the year before. It was up something like 17%.
Well, it got over the bit where it had been where it being forced to divest Honor, which
Yeah.
I never found at all plausible.
Yeah.
It was just one of these things where, yeah, all right, we'll give it to someone else. Like fuck it, it'll still be, it's a bit like BT divesting OpenReach. It's still part of BT.
Yeah.
But it partly had to do that because America's banned it, not just from getting hold of decent chips, but it's banned it from getting hold of decent Android as well.
Yeah, exactly.
But it seems to have really rebounded. And you look at numbers from people like Canalys or IDC or Counterpoint or whatever, or Omdia. I better say that, I'll get in trouble.
Yeah.
And Huawei's been recovering, Huawei itself, not Honor, but Huawei itself's been recovering lots of market share within China.
Yeah, so I think the 2023 performance that was 17% growth at the consumer business was quite back-ended, I think, as an analyst.
Towards the end of 23.
So you remember they
So
came
it's been
out with
ramping
this thing in September called Mate 60 Pro.
A suspiciously good chip.
US hawks were horrified by
Yeah.
it because people did teardowns and there are chips in there that they shouldn't have been able to get
7
access to.
nanometer process, yeah.
And we don't really want to go into all of that.
We've
because I
done
think
it exhaustively.
loads of times. But anyway, however they did it, whatever the explanation is.
They didn't stop you getting into it in your story, though, I
did get into
noticed.
it a little bit, yeah. But the
Bit of ASML, bit of EUV.
However they've done it, they're now in Omdia's table, which came out this week. The handset makers, like you were saying, they're ninth, I think, in that. They grew their shipments by more than any company in the top 10. 35% growth, I think, volume of shipments.
Right.
Actually,
you linked through to that.
Picked up a percentage point in market share. You can probably see it now. I think it's like 35% growth since 2023. Something like 45 million devices shipped. Obviously not where they were back in the day, but this is where the growth's coming from.
Yeah. I've seen other people.
Right.
So Omdia's got them 10th
Yeah.
with that 35%
ninth, isn't it?
growth. No, 10th on the table that you linked to.
Is it? Okay. I need to correct that.
But I've
seen it wrong. I've said ninth in my story.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I've seen people, maybe Counterpoint or other people who do these country breakdowns, have it a bit further up the list.
Right.
I mean, I know, but don't forget, this used to be my job, was coming up with these numbers.
Yeah.
I should do that strike through, pulling these numbers out of my arse. I mean, they're not. They are informed, but they are educated guesses. Sorry, both my colleagues and other analyst houses. They're not definitive. They're educated guesses where you're piecing together bits of market data to complete a puzzle. And so that's why you get variation between analysts, because there isn't just one single source of data. Hardly any people even publish their shipments numbers anymore. Back when I was doing it sort of 10, 15 years ago, some of them would publish it.
Yeah.
Or we used to have to play an absurd game with Samsung where we'd ring them up and we'd go, we reckon you shipped 100 million units. And they go, bit low. And we go, 110. They go, a bit high. It would be like 20 questions.
God.
I know, it's absurd. I don't know. They had to just play silly games with us. But anyway, that's why you get variation.
Yeah.
But I think what everyone agrees is that they're growing rapidly, and they're picking it up. And I think, I don't know what you think, Ian. I find it easy to believe that, and this is something I nodded to in my coverage of it, is, obviously the Chinese state is going to do everything it can to help Huawei.
Yeah.
And typically, and we're going to get onto this in a bit. A lot of the Chinese state intervention is what has everyone so worked up, because it flouts WTO rules, it takes the piss. They've been accused of things like currency manipulation in the past and all sorts of jiggery pokery. But then again, America's had such a big go at one of its national champions. I can't really fault them for using state power to bolster them, if that's what they're doing.
Yeah,
and of course they would deny they're doing that.
Yeah, well, also quite aside from the, we don't mind it so much with the USA because it's an ally in a democracy, whereas China's authoritarian. Put that to one side.
We're going to talk about Intel in a bit. There's a classic recipient of state largesse.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is like the US, I would say, is becoming like Donald Trump surrounded by all his tech bros. They're becoming that relationship between big business and the government, appointing someone like Elon Musk with all of his private sector interests into a top government job. It's just quite it's then really quite hypocritical to be to be accusing China of
I think so. And at risk of using the F word, one of the cardinal features of fascism is a close collaboration between big business and the state.
Yeah.
But there we are. I'm not saying anyone's a fascist.
No.
the argumentum ad Hitlerum fallacy.
You can see Tom Holland and Dominic Sambrook on another podcast. It's called The Rest Is History.
Yeah,
so
very good.
Trying to avoid throwing in the Trump references in one of their ones on Poland, I think, and the invasion. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean,
they did a good job of avoiding.
Well, that's the reason. I mean, you know, the reason this neo fallacy, you know, so logical fallacies originally, I think, were first noticed by Aristotle or something, but they're basically I call them rhetorical fallacies. There's logical fallacies that are purely to do with logic, like, you know, if A then B and all that sort of thing, to do with sets and all that sort of thing. But then there's rhetorical fallacies, which is what people use to win arguments by cheating.
Yeah.
A typical one would be ad hominem, where I attack you rather than your argument, for example. And this is one of the sort of neo fallacies called argumentum ad Hitlerum, and it's basically a subdivision of ad hominem, where if you're struggling to win an argument, just accuse the person of being Hitler,
right? Brilliant.
And then it's just game over. And then there's Godwin's law that says, as online arguments progress, the probability of someone invoking Nazis or Hitler or whatever reaches 1. In other words, it will always get there in the end. It's just a matter of how long it takes.
Yeah.
So, you know, we all do. We all know it happens, and the reason it happens is because it's one of those moral things about which there's rare unanimity.
Yeah.
No one's going, well, occasionally they do and they get pilloried for it, but no one's going, well, you know, they were right, those Nazis, they got bad press. Yeah. No one's saying that. It's total unanimity on the matter, and that's why it's used.
They got Germany organised, didn't they? The economy growing.
Something to do with trains running on time.
It was all piled into armaments, but what the hell?
Yeah, and so, I can't remember how we got on that tangent now.
Yeah, let's move away from that Hitler
before
stuff.
we get ourselves in deep shit.
Yeah.
Yes, so I think we were talking about state involvement. Yeah, that's what it was.
So I just to sort of return to where the growth's come from, trying to pick up on some clues from what Liang was saying. I think the smartphones bit is the driver of growth. This bit about the rapidly growing automotive and other stuff. I mean, if you look at what automotive was contributing in 2023, it's time. It was fast growing, but it's one of those. There was only like $1 before, so if you sell $5 worth
really
next
early,
year, it's like
it's
500% growth and all this. So it's quite a small part of the business. I mean, I think this is the
EVs are massive in China, though, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it has like really kind of rocketed and gone into some. I mean, maybe this is where some of the.
Well, I don't know how much of the EV value chain Huawei's involved in. You'd expect a company like that to be mainly involved in the sort of connected car entertainment side of it. But I think they might be involved in more stuff.
They were trying to do their own cars, weren't they, at one stage? And I don't know if they've moved away from that and to focus on the software more, because they call it something like Automotive Intelligent Solutions. Is the name of that business in 2023's annual report?
So like the self-driving stuff and
I think so. And I don't really have a lot of insight into what they do there because it's a bit out of our area and it's quite small, so you're not taking as much. The other bits, they used to have this unit called Enterprise. It used to be 3 units: carrier, consumer, and enterprise. And it's now been renamed.
And Enterprise was like IoT and that sort of thing.
Enterprise is everything else. It would have been like automotive and other stuff. And what they've done now is they've got this thing called ICT, which I'm guessing is mainly still networks. It looks like it from the size of it in terms of revenues. It's actually 51% of revenues in 2023.
Right.
The smartphone business has gone right down to being about 35% of revenues. And then you've got this enterprise stuff making up the rest. But they've broken out that enterprise group now into lots of different bits. So you've got automotive, intelligent automotive solutions. There's a bit called the cloud, which is really interesting. Because this is Huawei trying to be like a public cloud player, something they've been trying to do for a while. And if you look at some of the data that comes from people like John Dinsdale at Synergy, he's always said they're very small, but they are growing. You know, it's tiny, but they do claim to have a very big presence.
Well, I'll tell you what might help. I've got the screenshot I did of their annual stuff last year. And I got the geographic split, by the way. It was 67% China last year.
Oh, so I was pretty much on the money with 2/3.
You were spot on, mate.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if it's over 70% if they break it down that way this year. And then I've also got the business segment one, and you were right about ICT. You know, out of a total of, see there they get into yuan, then it's CNY. I still, is there a difference between yuan and renminbi?
I think it's the same.
Okay,
fine.
I don't think it's different.
So out of a total of 704 last year, 361 was ICT, so that's a little bit over half.
Yep.
And that only grew 2.3% last year.
Yep.
And consumer was 251, so call that just over
about 35%.
Yeah. I was going to say just over a quarter and then realised my maths was shit, so thank you for stepping in there.
Oh, wait, sorry to go back on this. The key difference is that the RMB is the official currency. The yuan is its principal unit of measurement. What?
I think it's the difference between sterling and pound.
Yeah, right.
I think it's that, and I've never really understood that, to be honest.
GBP and yeah.
Probably some hangover from the days of the gold standard and all that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And so consumer was there, but consumer was up 17% last year, by the way. Yeah. And then to your point about cloud computing,
17%. Yeah. So this is what I think is back ended with the Mate 60 Pro kind of coming out in September, and then apparently there was like this terrific sort of wave of orders.
And we think there's going to be a lot of growth for consumer this year.
I would be very surprised if it's not. I mean, I get the impression it's mainly consumer driven. You've got to remember that. Yeah. If they did 17% in a year when things weren't looking that great, and everybody's going, oh, where are they in handsets these days? You started to see them come back into those sorts of tables that Omdia does at the end of the year. You know, they're going up. Suddenly they're
going to head up.
I mean, I think
there's two other reasons why they will have grown. I think there probably will have been a little bit of state support. Maybe they will have helped them with finance, or maybe they will have, quote, encouraged retailers to stock them prominently, or that sort of thing. And the other one is I think their own platform's getting better and better. So this is back to a recurring theme of, that came up with DeepSeek, of necessity being the mother of invention. So Huawei's been banned from proper Google.
Yeah.
So it can use the open source kernel, but it can't use a Play Store and all that sort of thing. So it's gone off and done its Harmony OS, as I think it might still be called. And no one's going to use it outside of China, because why would you when Android is already there, if you're an Android person? But within China, it's probably got good enough that quite a lot of Chinese people are going, fuck it. Because don't forget, loads of apps that are available to everyone else through the Play Store are not available in China anyway.
Yeah.
So I think Harmony's probably got good enough that loads of Chinese people are going, this is as good as vanilla fucking Android anyway.
Yeah.
So, I wouldn't be surprised. And what did you think about my assumption that I wrote at the bottom of my story, that if that is there, we'd expect it to be reflected in their margins. We'd expect large margins to shrink if a greater proportion of their revenue is coming from consumer rather than networking kit.
Why would you think the margins would be?
Because margins on phones are tiny.
Yeah, probably. I mean, there's the other issue.
With the exception of Apple. Apple margins on iPhones are huge. Margins on Android phones are tiny.
It's a bit hard with Huawei because...
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always a bit confused with the Huawei margins anyway. I think, you might have the numbers open, but I think their operating margin went up from about 6.6%.
This is last year.
So I think, we're talking 2023, the last annual report. I think it went up from 6.6% in 2022 to about 13% or something, or 14% in 2023. I
haven't got percentages. I've got a table that says operating profit.
Yeah,
but that jumped up. But then there were exceptional things.
So it went up from 6.6%. I'm pretty sure to something like 14.8 or whatever.
But there were one-offs.
There's one-offs in some of those figures.
Yeah.
It's a bit hard to tell. I mean, the thing that's a bit counterintuitive also with the handsets being a bigger share of the business is if they are. This gets to the thing I said I wasn't going to talk about. But if they are using
Hitler.
Not him, no. This old ASML,
the ASML.
this older ASML technology called deep ultraviolet lithography. To sort of boil it down, one of the things that's happened with the chip situation is they can't get access to TSMC, which is the Taiwanese foundry anymore, because it uses some American tools.
Well, we think they can't, but there could be all sorts of clever ways.
They're not supposed to be able to. Yeah. There might be some workarounds. They might have been able to get some chips on the black market. But one of the reasons TSMC is so good is because they have access to this chip making tool called extreme ultraviolet lithography. There's only one company that does it, called ASML. It's based in the Netherlands, and ASML can't ship EUV stuff to China. It's basically been denied by the Dutch government export licenses.
Well, by the Americans.
Yeah, Americans have lent on it. There's this thing called the Wassenaar Agreement, I think, that covers this stuff. But they did ship DUV. It's an older sort of generation of technology called deep ultraviolet lithography to China
which
before.
is still good for up to about, I don't know, 10 nanometer.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. And then you can apparently, I mean, I don't know anything about this stuff. It's only from talking to experts, but you can apparently use it for things like double and quadruple patterning. You do the same thing again and again, and you get the measurements down to the sort of 7 nanometer and 5 nanometer.
It's just a slightly less artful, less efficient way of doing it.
It's less efficient, and people like Richard Windsor at Radio Free Mobile would say it's even unprofitable. Now, if it's unprofitable, and people were looking, I think, at SMIC would be the foundry that they're using instead of TSMC, the Chinese foundry SMIC.
It's their biggest.
If they're using SMIC and this DUV technology, and it is having an effect on like margins, then you'd think that SMIC's results, I do remember looking at a few months ago, and the margins were weak. They suffered. And I think there was speculation by people I was chatting to at the time, or maybe it was even Richard Windsor in his notes that he publishes, that was probably to do with this issue.
Yeah, and you could completely imagine the Chinese government leaning on them and going, look, do this thing, even though the raw economics of it don't add up.
Yeah,
we've got your back. We'll give you a fucking financial safety net. Just do it because it's got strategic importance.
So maybe it won't even show up in the Huawei results. We don't know how they could take that hit and how they could cover it. It might not even reflect in Huawei's reports, which it wouldn't happen in a normal kind of market economy, but it might. We don't really know. So. But yeah, I mean, I would think, if your point about the handsets margins being sort of thinner, I guess you would naturally expect that.
Well, I certainly know from my previous job that, Pierre, you sounded surprised. Apple will get something not far short of like 40 or 50% margins on an iPhone. So this is like I forgot what the word is. There's a word that describes the total cost of all the components and stuff that go into it.
Bill of materials.
There we are. Thank you. Whereas, and one of the reasons, there's two reasons why Apple gets much more margin. One, it charges more, which you two know only too well. But two, and this is Tim Cook's real strength, is it's got an incredibly efficient supply chain and everything's joined up. And Apple increasingly makes as much of the shit as possible itself. Like famously when it got into chips 5 or 10 years ago. And it actually resents anything it has to buy off anyone else. It resents, which is why it always had this litigation with Qualcomm over the modems, and even tried to get Intel to do it, which went horribly wrong. Presumably they still buy glass off someone like Corning or whatever, but I bet you they'd rather make everything themselves. They'd rather be completely self-reliant. And then the other thing is, with Android phones, you typically have to charge a bit less, although a premium Samsung phone's still well over $1,000, isn't it? And I think, and I don't think they have the efficiencies on the bill of materials. They don't have to pay Google any money for Android, which is why it succeeded, why Windows Mobile, for example, failed, because there's no license fee for Android. But there are other overheads associated with it where Google does claw back some value, where it says if you want the full fat, if you want the full Monty,
well, that's
you better make it worth our
That's
while.
what tripped them up, is because Android's supposed to be open source, but them being cut off from the sanctions is what everybody concentrates on, the kind of chip aspect, but arguably more damaging, and the thing that really kind of hammered them on the smartphone side was the Google thing, just not being able to get. I remember my mum had a Huawei phone at the time. She just got one, I think, when all this happened.
So it's probably really good value.
And things just stopped working on it, like Google Mail, which she uses, and things like that.
Gmail,
You just couldn't. And then I think the EE was actually good enough. Shout out to EE. They were actually good enough to just swap it for a Samsung phone.
Well, they should, because if they... Yeah. She could have argued, were she so inclined and clued up, she could have argued it was missold.
She could, but she didn't know the details. I had to sort of intervene.
Go to the shop and say, look, I've just heard about the fucking sanctions. You missold this. Give me a Samsung phone and less of the back chat.
No, I know you say so they should, but sometimes these companies, you don't associate them with doing the right thing necessarily on the consumer side.
Well, and also
with like salespeople in shops.
You can't necessarily expect,
exactly.
Some 21-year-old bloke to know all this.
Totally,
stuff. So anyway, so that's that, and I think what we presumably both took away from it is, even with all the caveats that we've just flown around, like maybe they massaged the books a little bit, maybe they've had a bit of help from the Chinese government, maybe this, maybe that, maybe their margins are down because they're getting more of it from smartphones. They're still pretty fucking strong numbers, aren't they?
Yeah.
There's no two ways about it.
Yeah, and I think the sad thing is, and this is what we don't know, and to the point about them retreating a bit, I think, from the limelight and wanting to have less to do with the press. And like, you know, we've got MWC coming up. There were times in the past when you'd get interviews even with Huawei executives.
Yeah.
Now, you might not get out of
Yeah,
what
I
you'd
remember
expect.
I did one on their stand. We just had a little chat.
Ray LeMaitre, our former boss, did an interview with Eric Xu one year.
Right.
It's actually cited in the reason the Eva Do book mentions light reading is because of that interview. But you can't really imagine that happening nowadays. They seem to be much more like, well, this is where he got us, and you know, we're gonna. And I think
I'll tell you, I won't tell you my source, but they freaked out over your story a couple of years ago over their dongle.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
I can imagine.
I've definitely heard that caused much
I can imagine.
wailing and gnashing of teeth in Shenzhen.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. But I think we're going to hear less about what they're up to, and I think that's a bit of a shame, really, because we want to sort of know what, you know, they used to have these big conferences and be a bit more open, not fully open, but more open than they are now. And I think this is a really interesting thing. I think they're not a telecom company anymore as much as they were. This is what we don't know about those results.
How diversified they are.
How diverse? What does ICT mean? How much are they doing in cloud? How much? Cloud goes beyond
and
China.
AI, for that matter.
Latin America is a big market for them apparently nowadays. They don't have the same kind of political pushback in Latin America and Africa that they do in Europe and North America. The cloud business is a big deal. Like our friend John Strand at Strand Consult is often on about this. I mean, he's quite obviously outspokenly critical of Huawei. He's hawkish towards China, but he's pointed out a lot about their sort of cloud presence in Latin America and what they're doing there.
Yeah.
The AI stuff's really interesting. It's connected with that, obviously, but they have this high silicon business that they've got is obviously
that's been around for ages.
It's obviously really bloody good. Yeah, I mean, the reason that they're regarded so highly for the quality of their technology and the stuff that's going into the radio units and the baseband that they're doing, a lot of that's coming from high silicon. That's silicon innovation that they're putting into their 5G network equipment that's kept them ahead, or did keep them ahead of Ericsson and Nokia back in the day. And that's the unit now that's moving into doing AI chips. They have this range called Ascend. This is going to segue us a bit, I think, into stuff that you might want to talk about.
Sure.
But some of the reports about DeepSeek, this Chinese AI that we talked about a lot a week ago, have suggested that Ascend is supporting that for inference. You know, at the edge, it's been deployed on that.
Right.
The thing is, we don't really have. We have less insight into what's going on now than we used to have, I think, because Huawei, because you ask them questions about this and they don't really want to engage and talk about it. And I don't blame them in a way.
They used to do a London annual
They did, yeah.
And they'd all be up on stage. I mean, to be honest, they were usually a bit boring, and a bit corporate, but they made the effort. I mean, they do it in Park Lane and stuff. One
thing I'd say, because you were sort of frowning earlier when I was saying they feel that the PR outreach that they did between 2019 and 2021 or whatever didn't really get them anywhere, and therefore their response is to sort of retreat and not engage. I wasn't
frowning. I was just trying to qualify it. I was just processing it and trying to work out to what extent I totally agree.
That's what they think, and I have pushed back on that to them and said that I think if they hadn't done all of that, I think people like us and journalists, there are obviously always going to be the anti-Huawei US hawks who you'll never convince one way or the other. But imagine that they'd completely not engaged when all this was going on, when the UK was discussing what they should do in terms of a ban, and sanctions were being imposed by the first Trump administration, then tightened up by Biden. Imagine if they'd just gone, we don't want to speak to you at all. You'd have thought much, much worse of them. People would then have gone, well, they're definitely hiding stuff.
I'll tell you a great exemplar of that. Take this conversation we're having now, where there's lots of conjecture, lots of assumptions, lots of trying to read between the lines. If Huawei hadn't engaged in that intervening time, if you hadn't gone out and got pissed with them yesterday, believe me, I'm not for 1 second suggesting this is transactional. Of course it's not. But the fact that we're still in touch with them, and the fact that they still have a human face, and all that sort of thing, means that, I speak only for myself, but I suspect you feel the same, that when I'm weighing it up I'm not going for this goodies and baddies narrative, where the West are the goodies and the Chinese are the baddies, which is what the security state of the US will have us believe.
Yeah.
That they're the goodies, and the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and whoever else is on their shit list, North Koreans, they're all the baddies. I mean, there's some truth to it. You know, as we'll probably get to in a sec, you know, I'm not discounting the amount of fuckery that China gets up to.
Yeah.
But we get up to fuckery too. And I just think, you know, I'm happy that tone that we strike, where we're just looking for nuance. We're not being naive. We're not saying China are the goodies and America the baddies, which is what some people might, when they get really hostile to their own government, they might completely invert it, which I think is wrong as well.
Yeah.
We're just trying to be nuanced and trying to, you know, back to what I said earlier about how journalism is trying to separate truth from narrative. We're trying to get past the narrative and just trying to work out what the truth is. Doesn't matter what it is. We don't have an opinion on whether there's good truth or bad truth. There's just the truth. And that's what all journalism should be. You're just trying to find out. It's for other people to decide how they feel about those facts.
Yeah.
Our job is just to try and get hold of them and publish and stick them in the public domain. So, yeah. So that's how I feel about that. It's good that they engage. I think it is sad that they become more opaque. I understand why.
I understand why, but I don't, you know, and I think if I was trying to convey a message to them, it would be that if you hadn't had that PR engagement that you had in that period, people like us who do take a balanced view of them, and I think a lot of the press has tried to write about them in a balanced way, would have been much more skewed. I think there would have been an assumption that they were in the wrong and that they knew they were in the wrong and that there was a smoking gun and they were just, you know, hiding it, and then maybe things would have been even worse for them than they are. Yeah.
Well, and I've actually always
even worse for them than they are. 22% revenue.
Yeah, no, they're doing fine. But you mean you mean outside of China?
In terms of the efforts to try and damage them, which I think have been quite
and I've always
futile
quite
in many
respected
ways.
that they've continued to engage with us. I mean, you know, sometimes, and I'm sure I've said this to Ben and Hazel and their predecessors when I've chatted to them. I'm sometimes going, you know, why the fuck are you bothering when our government's just basically told you to shove off? But I actually quite respect the fact that they persist, and also that they, with a few exceptions, don't lean into the victim narrative too much, because there's a dignity to that, and there's a like, okay, I know we're being treated. I'm sure they perceive unfairly, and I've got some degree of sympathy for that perception.
Yeah,
given the lack of hard evidence of their foul play. Having said that, I find it completely believable that if Xi Jinping goes to Ren Zhengfei and goes, look, I've got a strategy here. Oh, here's a really good little mini tangent. There's an American journalist. He was a very prominent mainstream journalist, and he's gone sort of freelance since he was sacked from Fox News, called Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
And he's actually doing some really interesting interviews, regardless of what you think of Tucker. And he's obviously he's of the right politically, but you know he'll go over to Russia and speak to Putin.
Yeah, he got sort of derided.
Because
ask him easy questions.
He allowed him to rabbit on about 12th century Ukraine, and now it's always been part of Russia anyway.
Totally, but I still maintain, and all those criticisms are valid, I still maintain it's better that he did it than he didn't.
Yeah.
Even if a lot of it's bollocks. I think more information, more dialogue is always better.
Lex Fridman is going there.
You what?
Lex Fridman is
Fridman's going over there, and Lex Fridman did a really interesting one with Zelensky. And anyway, recently Tucker went over to Saudi Arabia and did one with one of their elite, super rich dudes. I forget his name. He's part of the Saudi royal family, and he's one of the richest people. He's a massive investor.
Right.
And actually, when I did a bit of Googling on him, I don't know if you know. So you know the guy who's totally in charge and who's associated with the Khashoggi thing.
I wondered if Khashoggi was going to come up.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's another place to chalk off my "I'm not fucking flying there" list, or if I do, I'm going to shit myself in the airport sort of list.
Yeah. No, I can't see myself going to Saudi Arabia in a lot of ways. Really.
Have you seen the?
Hasn't Informer got massive trade shows?
They have
documentary.
You what?
The
documentary about Khashoggi?
Yeah.
I haven't, no.
It's really good.
I bet it is. So the allegation, and you know, if I do go to Saudi Arabia, IBS, I'm not saying this.
MBS.
This is MBS, sorry.
MBS.
Yeah, IBS is irritable bowel syndrome. I'm not associating you with a lower intestinal disorder. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman.
Khashoggi might associate him with the lower intestinal disorder.
among others.
Oh my God.
So yes, just to get that, if anyone doesn't know what the reference we're making is, he was this journalist who ended up allegedly getting kidnapped and killed at the behest.
I think he was kidnapped and killed.
No, he
I know, just say allegedly because he was so kidnapped and killed that there's no evidence of it.
He admitted to it at the end, I think.
Did he?
Yeah.
MBS.
MBS.
I keep wanting to say IBS. Anyway, so that's the allegation. The reason I say allegedly is because I'm not making the allegation in case I fucking have to go to Saudi Arabia and all that. But anyway, so he was accused of that. But in 2017, this guy, Mohammed bin Salman, who's basically the head of Saudi Arabia, and it's a monarchy, the Saud family, he sort of had one of these purges. Xi Jinping did that. They call it a anti-corruption drive.
Right.
Which
They call it
actually
Night of the Long Knives, do they?
It's basically like that. Well, except that it's not along ideological grounds. It seems to be mainly along, it's just power concentration.
Yeah.
And so they'll find people, accuse them of corruption, corruption in inverted commas, whatever that might mean, and basically hold them to ransom. And this guy who Tucker Carlson spoke to, this is according to Wikipedia, he was one of these people, I think the purge was in 2017 that MBS did. And this geezer had to hand over $6 billion to suddenly not be corrupt anymore. So that's kind of how transactional it is.
Right.
Anyway, he's still around and he seems to feel sufficiently not worried enough to be able to chat to Tucker Carlson and have it be published. And Tucker Carlson does it in the podcast extended conversation format. And anyway, so bringing it back from that tangent, Tucker Carlson was asking him actually some quite good questions. For all the criticism he deservedly got for the Putin one, I actually thought this was quite a good conversation. He asked him some really
maybe
interesting
taking
questions.
the criticism on board.
No, I don't think he listens. I think Tucker Carlson exists in a bubble and just does his Tucker thing.
Right.
He doesn't have a telly, and he doesn't have a smartphone.
Oh my! You're really selling this guy to me. So he's got no clue what's going on in the world, and he just goes around and meets random people.
He's got a really weird laughter as well.
Yeah, he's got a weird laugh. But anyway, but just take it in isolation. You don't have to like or dislike the guy. You just have to appreciate the fact that he's speaking to one of the most influential people of the world.
Yeah, okay.
And he asked him about Jack Ma in China. And for people who don't know, Jack Ma is Alibaba. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's like an equivalent of someone like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or whoever in China. And then one time a few years ago, he'd been starting to go, Xi Jinping, he's fucking taking the piss. I'm not happy about him. And then suddenly he disappeared for about 6 months, just totally off the radar. And then when he came back, he was like, yeah, no, I think everything's cool.
He was in a retreat.
Yeah, I've had a bit of a think.
A wellness retreat.
I've had a bit of a think, and I think the country's run fucking great, if I'm honest. And anyway, and everyone was going, oh, okay, so he got disappeared, and he got sent off to room 101 and got rats tied to his face until he learned to behave himself. But that was all just conjecture. This Saudi guy basically said it in this interview with Tucker Carlson. He goes, yeah. He's, again, I'm paraphrasing, but he's going, yeah, he's getting a bit lippy. He had a bit of a quiet time, and now he's playing ball. You listen to it. Honestly, listen to the interview. It's quite chilling when he says it, because he says it in almost a sort of jokey way. He goes, yeah, we all get over our skis every now and then. He had to fucking wind his neck in a little bit. But it's obviously deeply sinister.
Yeah.
And how did I get onto... Oh, yeah, we're just talking about how, we can imagine that if that can happen to Jack Ma, it can happen to Ren Zhengfei, it can happen to anyone.
Yeah.
And so, yes, of course, Xi Jinping, if he chooses to exercise force on someone within China, he's shown it, like in the case of Jack Ma, that he can.
Well, I think Kate to keep bringing her book up again and again.
No, it's fair enough.
But
it's a good book by the sounds of it.
It is. It's worth reading. And also not a lot has been written on Huawei at length, and not a lot of books have been done on them anyway. So... but Eva Du's book is very good, actually, on the whole jockeying, I suppose, between Ren Zhengfei and various Chinese leaders that have been in power over the time. I mean, this guy's quite old now, and he was former sort of engineer in the army, I think, going back into the sort of 80s period.
Yeah.
And then started.
And of course, his links to the military add to the sense
to the military, but it's going back quite a long way. I mean, he was getting this going in the sort of Deng Xiaoping era, Tiananmen Square.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of concerns about after the kind of Cultural Revolution under, Mao and all that lot. And then China was sort of coming out. China in the 80s and the 90s was a bit like, it was a bit chaotic. It's almost like Russia in the sort of...
A bit of a free-for-all.
A bit of a free-for-all.
Yeah.
Like, which way is it going to go? We're not really sure what's happening. It was a bit chaotic.
Post-communism, the analogy is very similar.
And there was a lot of concern about, how do we behave around the state? What's our relationship with the government? This kind of thing that I think she analyses quite well. But today, it's obviously a key question with someone like Xi Jinping in power, who's kind of consolidated
and he
power.
does have absolute power, pretty much.
He's got absolute power, and it seems like he's there for life, isn't he? He's sort of president for life. I think he's.
Well, he fucked around with the constitution or whatever their equivalent thing is a little while back.
I think we should.
He doesn't even have to rotate.
I think we should just maybe before we move it on, but quickly sort of because I think we came in saying a lot of the mainstream press were going, like sanctions haven't really worked. And why haven't they worked, and why hasn't that geopolitical backlash worked?
Why hasn't Huawei been splattered by the...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit more nuanced and a bit more, I think the sanctions attempting to cut Huawei off from chip technology, which is the one area where the US feels it has leverage, I guess. And
until recently, AI.
And until recently, AI, but even that seems to be to do with chips. It's like deny them the GPUs and they won't be able to
Well, that
do
was what was so disruptive, as we spoke about it before. What's so disruptive is it seemed to be a lighter use of GPUs.
Yeah, I mean, I think one area where it obviously really did have an effect on them was smartphones. You clearly saw that their revenues went down. So it wasn't that they weren't hurt, actually. They were badly hurt. They really suffered, and they had to sell this Honor brand. And we don't really know the full story about this ability to get 7 nanometer chips into these latest. We can only speculate and go on what we hear analysts saying and what other reports we're reading and what what we're hearing from people. But they seem to have managed to recover. Now, whether it is using DUV technology or whether it's getting stuff on the black market, I think it shows that whatever you do on the sanctions front, someone will find some way around it. Whether it's a loophole or whether
I think the best case scenario is that you just delay things a bit.
You delay things.
And so we look at Huawei's numbers. We could argue, if we just look at revenues, that they set them back arguably 4 years.
Yeah.
And that's not insignificant, obviously, but it's still only 4 years. And China famously is a very patient country.
It is,
especially when the leader doesn't need to worry about elections and shit like that.
Yeah, but they've clearly suffered the fact that they're that Omdia table. Our brilliant sister company has put together, which I've mistakenly said they're 9th in it, and I need to change that after this podcast.
How embarrassing!
They're 10th in that table. I mean, where were they?
Compared to my typos, you're doing well, mate.
Where were they in 2019, 2018? They'd have been right up there at the top, wouldn't they? Along with Apple and Samsung, they'd have been.
Oh yeah, and so when I was strategy analytics and I was doing it, they were typically 3rd or 4th.
Right.
So you'd have Apple, Samsung. Huawei would typically be the 2nd or 3rd.
And that's going back. That's going back quite a way anyway.
That's going back
there.
Like 10 plus years.
So it has hurt them. I think the network stuff. Where there doesn't seem to have been that much of an impact. I think that the issue there is, and we've talked about this as well before, but you're less dependent on having access to these most advanced chips in networking equipment.
Yeah.
There's far fewer base stations shipped for a start anyway, and they're always a couple of generations behind.
Manufacturing process is a big arms race on phones.
It's a big arms race on phones.
Because of the space constraints.
Because of the space constraint. Less so in network. Now, it does have some effect, but it just isn't quite as strong. And you're always going to have this issue of the Chinese in a market where there aren't very many options anyway. It's not like there's a Xiaomi and a Vivo and a whatever, a Transsion and all these other companies. Transsion's the latest one that I'm sort of...
Every now and then something crops up from nowhere and sends zillions.
There's dozens of these Chinese smartphone makers. Well, there aren't in network equipment. And the Chinese state is always going to drive China Mobile, China Telecom, and what's the other one? Unicom, towards Huawei and ZTE. And in a massive market like that, where there's like 2 million base stations or whatever it is, even if you are suffering a little bit on the chip side of things, you've still got a huge market to serve. And then the other factor is, I think the geopolitical backlash just hasn't gone as far as we as the US would have wanted it to. Germany still is incredibly reliant on Chinese electronics. And the reason why that isn't probably not going to change is because if they go and ban Huawei and Chinese companies from operating the German market, the Chinese will turn around and go, well, they'll do the sort of stuff that's going on at the moment at the US level with tariffs, you impose a tariff of 25%, we're going to impose a tariff of 25%.
Well, let's use that as the opportunity, and I'm not going to go on it too long because we spent a bit longer just on sort of Huawei conjecture than I thought we would, which is fine, it's all good stuff. And obviously,
you were thinking we only have one number to talk about.
It's amazing how much value we get out of one fucking data point, isn't it? On the geopolitical stuff and the tariffs. So there we are. We've got a story I wrote at the start of this week. China targets Google with its inevitable retaliation over new US tariffs was my headline. So people remember that Trump just came out. He's been doing these executive orders where he sits there with a pen and goes, yeah, this is a good one. And it's all just really weirdly performative. But he just loves it. I mean, there's a part of me that I just think he just looks like he's having a laugch. He just...
While he screws up the world's economy.
One day eventually he's going to be like, no executive orders today? Oh.
Yeah, what am I going to do? I'm going to have to play golf.
Yeah, so boring.
And keep an eye on the fucking bushes.
He can play golf in the Gaza Strip, can't he, in the future?
Yes.
He'd be like, can we just come up with an executive order? Oh, yeah.
That's his latest bright idea.
He's going to turn the Gaza Strip into Mar-a-Lago.
I mean, this is it. I'll only indulge this tangent very briefly, but it's consistent with this sort of shooting from the hip approach that Trump seems to have. And, everyone knows that the Israel-Gaza Palestinian thing's been awful for decades and has been especially awful in the last year. And he just goes, I'll tell you what, we'll take it over. We'll turn it into fucking...
Disneyland.
Yeah, we'll turn it into Palestine world. And meanwhile, the Palestinians, he goes, we'll get them a beautiful new place. Beautiful buildings. It'll be
somewhere else.
And he goes, it'll be tremendous.
Not in America though, presumably.
No, it'll be in Jordan or Egypt.
It will. Yeah.
Whether or not he's checked in with Jordan or Egypt on this is another matter. Let alone the Palestinians, of which there's still, I think, 2 million or so. But he's going, lad, don't worry, I've got this. and there's a part of you just got that where you're just like, well, fucking hell. I mean, the chutzpah, the sheer blind arrogance of the bloke to just come out with this stuff. I think
it's like putting a 12-year-old on the job and saying, "What do you want to do?" And they go, "Well, can't you just move them somewhere?"
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's funny.
I never thought of that. Yeah,
it's funny you refer to children because I think part of it, a flip side is, if like, your kids. I mean, you might have this now. How old are your girls, Pia?
5 and 7.
5 and 7. Yeah, they're at that age where they're fighting over a toy or they're not sharing in the way that you want. And sometimes, as a parent, you come in and nuke it and you go, okay, well, I'm taking the toy away from both of you. I'll throw it out or whatever. Don't make me stop the car sort of thing. It's like he's just come in. No one's been able to agree on anything. He's gone, all right, then, we'll turn it into a fucking golf course. And it's just to sort of get people's attention where they go, no, you can't do that. And he's going, all right, then, come up with a better idea. That's my idea. What's your fucking idea? Is what he seems to be saying. And I obviously reckon that's what he's doing. And there's a part of it, it's so counterintuitive and it's probably bollocks. But there's a part of it to me where I'm just like, well, everything else has failed. Maybe Trump just going, all right, then, here's
well, I mean, we don't want to go down this tangent, but I think it's a very sensitive topic and it sounds like ethnic cleansing almost. It's the verge of that. The idea that you clean out a territory of people.
Well, you can't force them to leave. I mean, if you do force them to leave, then it's a war crime.
The Jeremy Bowen BBC, and Jeremy Bowen's been in that region for about 100 years covering this stuff, and his take was that, so I kind of trust him more than I would most BBC journalists. His take was it would be quite damaging, just the comments that he's made in the long run. But we're going off on a...
Well, but I'll bring it back because this foreign policy the collateral damage that comes from foreign policy is a common thread. And by the way, I just want to reflect on one last thing Trump said on this trivialising it. He goes, why would they want to stay there? It's fucking rubble now. And it's like, what, don't you reflect on the irony of that?
Yeah.
So by that logic, you could just go and blow up anywhere and then say, well, you don't want to stay there anymore. We've just blown it up. Yeah. Anyway, yes, it's that. I've said it loads of times on the pod before, and I'll say it again. America's going for this very muscular approach. Like other podcasts I listen to a few right-wingers, and probably the most right-wing American commentator I listen to is a bloke called Ben Shapiro, who's an American Orthodox Jew, and he's very pro-Israel. And he's very pro-Trump. And he's very they talk about a thing. Have you ever heard a thing called the Monroe Doctrine? Which basically says, that whole half of the world is America's, and it gets to tell everyone what to do. And throughout the post-war period, it particularly affected Latin America and led to lots of resentment in Latin America, where I've got family, so I've got some sense of it from the ground level. And they were just like, oh, fuck off. And they'd engineer these coups, and the CIA would get involved and all this sort of stuff. That's where the term Banana Republic came from and all that. And they seem to be leaning into a bit of that, which is like, look, we got the most money, we got the most guns, we got the biggest cultural power, all of which is true. So do what you're fucking told. Now, on one level, you sort of think, all right, you can't argue with that, but there's a reason why it's not as simple as that, which is that people, and this, to my story about the tariffs, apart from the Chinese tariffs, they just slapped 25% tariffs on everything coming from Canada and Mexico. They're only two geographic neighbours.
Yeah.
And
where I'm assuming there's a huge amount of trade, because you tend to trade more with your neighbours than you do
Indeed.
with...
And again, they're throwing their weight around because it probably would, while it would be damaging, tariffs are always damaging on both sides.
Yeah.
Because they're basically a tax. This 4-pack of Hazy Jane cost me £5.50 from Sainsbury's, because it's on price promotions, normally £7. In fact, I'll go £7 because that'll make the maths easier. And then you stick a 25% tariff on it, and then suddenly it's costing me a tenner.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just inflation, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that tenner, that difference, that, I'm obviously rounding off, but let's say for the sake of argument, that £3 difference just goes to the government. So it's just another form of tax, which is inflationary.
Yeah.
But he's betting that it's going to be more damaging politically.
The government that meanwhile his close colleague Elon Musk is trying to cut down and reduce spending in, so we shouldn't need as much tax to sort of pay for it to run.
Yeah, I don't think that's completely incoherent, because the ultimate aim, which I applaud, is for governments to not be in deficit, to not be constantly borrowing.
Yeah.
Because the reason why that's ultimately bad is because you're mortgaging the future. And our kids are going to pay for that borrowing by having shitter public services.
But it seems so far they're cutting in really weird places.
Yeah. Well, that's totally true. And they're all over, and it's just as haphazard as everything else we've been talking about. But all I'm saying is, to Ian's point, it's not completely incoherent, because if those tariffs create more government revenues, then in principle that could be used to cut taxes. Whether that happens in practice is another matter. Anyway,
well, it is a tax, though, isn't it? It's a tax in
cut
one
income
area.
tax, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you're taxing in one area and
no, it's true. You're
taxing in another.
You're
so
taking from Peter to pay Paul, totally.
Yeah.
But
I mean, American consumers will suffer if those.
So that's what I'm leading up to.
Through.
What he seems to be betting on politically is, yes, American consumers will suffer, but he thinks the Canadians and Mexicans will blink first.
Yeah.
Because they will suffer more.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a hell of a bluff. And maybe it's a bluff that's born of someone who's in his second term and is just throwing caution to the wind.
Well, I don't really get the blink first. I don't really get what he's trying to accomplish.
Because I think it's more damaging. I think those tariffs will end up being more damaging to the people he's imposing on than it will be to America.
Yeah, but so it's just a pure protectionist thing, and we're going to do the stuff that the Canadians used to do. We'll do it here instead.
Well, it's more than protectionist. It's just bully pulpit. It's basically saying, do what you're told, or we'll do this.
Yes, but the bully pulpit stuff that was thrown at the Mexicans, which is very much to do with things like immigration, and you can The Canadian thing, I just don't get at all. I mean, what does he seriously want them to become another state? I mean, this whole drugs thing's pathetic. That's not a real reason.
But that's the stated reason, but
it's not. Everybody knows that there isn't an issue with fentanyl coming across the. There might be a little
small
bit,
issue,
but it's tiny. It's tiny. It's not like a major deal between.
I agree with you. It's just reasons in inverted commas.
So then I'm thinking, well, what is this about then? Really,
I think it's just about pushing people around.
Yeah, but to what end?
To America's benefit. Whatever Trump wants Canada to do, whether it's renegotiating trade deals, whether it's selling its oil more cheaply, whether it is tightening up the border, because there presumably is some border leakage. God knows it's a massive border. Whatever Trump wants them to do, rather than try and use
It's not
normal.
obvious what he wants them to do.
No,
apart
it's
from the
not
fentanyl
obvious.
stuff, which
It's not
doesn't sound
obvious.
like an issue. So that's.
But
the
I'm just
problem.
saying,
But-
being devil's advocate, whatever it is that he wants them to do, he's going for a more forceful, muscular, direct, transactional approach.
Anyway, I think we should bring it back to telecom.
Yeah. Well, the reason it is telecoms-y, I like the way you take us off on a tangent, and then you give me a little look.
No, I
as if
didn't. I
I've
didn't
got
go
no
down the
fucking
tariff
discipline.
tangent. I mentioned it very quickly at the end of my Huawei piece.
All right.
Yeah.
I mentioned the Mexico and Canada stuff, and it did turn out like a day after he threatened these 25% tariffs, they suddenly were making all these gestures to appease him. And then I said in my writing, China is another matter, however. While it may be easy to push around neighbours and supposed allies that are heavily dependent on trade with the US, China is the world's second largest economy and has its own extensive sphere of influence. And ultimately what it comes down to is my criticism of this approach, which is that you can try it. There's two reasons why tariffs are bad. One, that we just sort of kind of skirted around in that tangent, which is what the fuck are you trying to get from it? And the second one is, well, there's three actually. Second one, which I covered in this story, which is that you'll just get reciprocation from China.
Yeah.
So you just get this escalating trade war, which, we all know impoverishes everyone eventually.
Yeah.
Even if America normally wins, in inverted commas, it will be to the detriment of regular people.
Well, I don't think. I mean, they're not going to win with China.
It depends how you define win, of course.
Yeah, I mean, there are, like you say, I don't think there's any winners from tariff wars anyway.
I don't think so.
But I mean,
But maybe Trump's not looking at it that way. Maybe if he sets back, their tech industry by a couple of years, he considers that a win. I think that the collateral damage is too high a price to pay. But then I'm not the bloke in charge of the country.
It gets called protectionism and this gets to the whole sort of deglobalization thing that you slap tariffs on. The stuff that's coming in with the view, the kind of blinkered view, in my opinion, that it will kind of spur local industries and it'll turn consumers towards American products instead and give some kind of, it'll provide some kind of revival for the stuff that we don't do anymore that China does, which I think is just a really daft idea.
Yeah.
These things aren't going to be done. All the products that the US is buying from Canada, like the maple syrup and
the oil
and the oil and the Chinese electronics they're getting are not going to be replaced by
timber.
The timber. It's not going to have American alternatives. People still need to get that stuff. So
no, you're completely right. And so tariffs are a shit idea. Again, it's so hard to work out exactly what Trump's MO is and why he's doing stuff. But most people argue that tariffs are a shit idea, and as do I. That's going to be a bit warmer. I have a colder one here. But his rationale seems to be the ends justify the means. And if by imposing these tariffs and creating economic pain for his own population in the short term, he ends up winning by however he defines winning in the long term, then he thinks that's a price worth paying. And I'm calling that into question. But then bring it back to my story. China, and again, China tends to play the long game a little bit more. And they just went, okay, thanks for giving us those tariffs. We've just suddenly decided that Google might be a monopolist. It's a bit like we went all the way back to talking about...
no kidding.
Talking about men getting kidnapped by Canada, and then suddenly a couple of Canadians got arrested.
Do you know what? I'd actually agree with China that Google's a monopolist.
Well, yes. But prior to this, China has decided not to take antitrust action against it, and then coincidentally, the moment these tariffs come out, they've decided to have a go.
Well, which the EU's been doing for years, hasn't it? Going after Google for antitrust reasons.
Yeah. But if China does it, it's likely to be less transparent and more, and the outcome's likely to be more prescribed, I would have thought.
Yeah.
But as I wrote in my piece, I think this is just a little taste. There you go. We can have a little look at Google. The thing is, Google doesn't actually have much of a presence in China for some of the reasons we described. But other one, and this is worth stressing again, when we're moaning about America being unilateral and heavy-handed, China doesn't allow loads of Western companies to operate in China. For example, Facebook.
Yeah.
God, I remember that. I was quite naive. Remember when we went to China in 2016 and I was just trying to put up pictures of cute pagodas and shit on Facebook. And I was having real trouble doing it, and I completely discounted the Great Firewall.
I remember being there and struggling to use anything at all. I think I was quite frustrated. I couldn't get access to emails and things in Google Mail, and it was just quite hard to look at searches and very
so they restrict loads
quite different
of shit.
from Hong Kong. If you've been to Hong Kong and you go to another bit of China, it's a real noticeable difference.
Well, I've only been to Hong Kong once, which is where I first met Sean Carr from Telecom TV, or at least first met him properly to get pissed with.
In a bar, there's a shocker.
Yeah. Well, but Sean's actually really clued up on Hong Kong. I think he lived there.
Yeah.
And he took us to this like foreign correspondence club, and it's got all this sort of cute post-colonial sort of stuff going on.
Yeah.
You can just imagine being some expat, some sort of some supercilious Brit,
smoking
looking
opium
down at the locals. What's I going to say? Yeah, so there's that going on, but so they've had a go at Google, who doesn't have much of a presence in China. But what I took from that, again, the criminology, the reading between the lines, I took from that is like it's Google today.
Well,
but tomorrow it could be Apple.
Well, the one that's quite interesting, I mean, Apple always gets thrown out there.
Yeah.
But what a result I covered this week, which I normally wouldn't write about in much detail, but you know, when you're going out to have one of those long lunches and you feel like you need to get up early and get a story on the side.
Yeah, I don't know what you mean.
I did Qualcomm's.
Right. You actually did their quarterlies, did you?
And I looked at their quarterlies. I tried to pick out.
They've just settled with ARM, haven't they?
Yeah, I didn't go into the ARM stuff.
Right.
What the thing I went into was the geopolitics a little bit, because they're incredibly exposed to China. I mean, that was my headline pretty much. It's increasingly exposed to China. They did this weird thing of, they show a breakdown of geographical revenues, as Ericsson and Nokia would do. And they used to be really high, like 60-odd%, maybe 2/3 to China.
Right.
And then you looked at their explanation for that, and what they were saying was it's the destination the chips are being shipped to. So it might be Samsung receiving them in China because it's doing work in a factory in China, but the company is actually Samsung, it's South Korean.
It's a supply chain thing.
So what they've done is they've changed the definition to be shipments to the country means that the customer has headquarters in China now. And that it's actually made it seem worse,
right,
rather than better, because even though it's lower the percentage, it's still 48%, and it's up from something like 30-odd%, like in 20. So
Qualcomm's like almost a monopolist when it comes to smartphone modems, isn't it?
Smartphone modems, their China business grew like as a percentage of overall revenues, where they're getting the money from is increasingly from customers that have headquarters in China. It's this lot that we mentioned in that Omdia table. It's the Transsion, it's the Vivo, it's the, and
they're all going to use not just Qualcomm modems, they're going to use Snapdragon processors.
They use application processing units as well. So the logical conclusion from people who get really wound up about this sort of thing, like Marco Rubio or whatever, is that all these Chinese smartphones are being powered by a US company's technology. Where's that?
Well, exactly. So let's draw.
And not to mention China itself could really.
Let's tie it all together and move it on. I mean, that really fits into my point, which is globalization. Has, compared to 100 years ago, the average standard of living for everyone, if we average it out over the whole globe, so it includes like really poor places like Sub-Saharan Africa or whatever, everyone's richer. And one of the main reasons everyone's richer is because of globalization and global trade. And I know there's lots of downsides. You get parts of England, for example, Northern England, that feel completely shortchanged by globalization, and I think that's a lot of the reason why.
Come from one of them.
There we go, and that's a lot of the reasons why they voted for Brexit. Their reasons were different, but they felt fucked over by this globalization trend. But the upside is when everyone's trading. A lot of people don't seem to understand this about basic economics. That wealth is the flow of money. Or wealth is a flow of money and materials and goods and services and all that sort of thing. It's not the accumulation. We were chatting, weren't we, on our little chat group about mercantilism. And I linked to a thing about mercantilism, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole now because I'm trying to move things along. But mercantilism was like a theory that's quite popular, like pre-Enlightenment, where you just always wanted the balance of trade to be in your favour. You wanted to be selling more shit internationally than you're buying. The assumption being that then the resulting accumulation of what they call bullion, which is like an archaic term for just wealth, really.
Yeah.
But
Gold.
bullion's normally, used to describe gold. But then gold is just a storage of wealth, isn't it? A physical storage of wealth. And this was back when currency was actually tied to gold, not this fiat currency that they can just print it these days.
Well, you get captive markets as well, where you just sort of flood that country that it got associated with imperialism a lot, because you sort of take over a country, but you're exporting all of your stuff to that country, and then that's another market for your products, basically.
East India Company and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that sort of thing. But
so anyway, but mercantilism, as I actually wrote I don't think I said bollocks, I think rubbish. But where I a bit less grown up, I would have written, people stop doing it because it's bollocks. And the reason it's bollocks, I think this is probably a massive oversimplification. If anyone's listening to this who's got a better economics education than I do, which is nearly everyone, then they'll probably be thinking, Scott, you're really oversimplifying it, but fuck it, it's my podcast, so I'm going to do it anyway. If you imagine your own wealth, let's say you had 100 grand. But you just stuck that 100 grand in notes under a mattress and you just left it there. You're not actually, on paper you're more wealthy, but in practice you're not wealthy at all. You're still having to deal with the same cash flow situation you're in now. That 100 grand is irrelevant. That 100 grand only manifests itself as wealth when you spend it. And then you go off and buy a new car, and then you buy a nicer house, and you go on holiday, and you whatever. So that's the way I always think about how wealth works. It's flow.
yeah,
It's not just accumulation. And this is why mercantilism is a bad idea. This is why protectionism is a bad idea. Protectionism is just a manifestation of mercantilist philosophy. And that's why I think all this stuff that they're going on about is a shit idea. This is why globalization has enriched everyone, and why this is a backward step, what we seem to be doing now, which is to try and deglobalize, or at least split the world in two between the Chinese sphere of influence and the US sphere of influence.
Yep.
It's going to make everyone poorer. It might make America and China politically feel better because they've told the other baddies to fuck off, but it's going to make everyone else feel poorer. So yeah, that's that one. Look, we better move it on, because we've been banging on about this for ages, and we've got a couple of other topics we want to do.
yes.
You, Ian, have written a couple of things about the chip maker Intel.
Yes.
Why don't you take it?
Yeah, Intel, which apparently got knocked off the top spot as chip making revenues in its last year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a lot of people. No, I think Samsung.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. Does this include all chips, like memory chips and chips?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I think it's just a very, very crude, like, what are you making in headline revenues?
Right.
Because even though people would look at Nvidia and go, well, that's obviously the premier chip company these days, that's the one that everyone's excited about. It's worth bloody $3 trillion still, nearly, even after
That's
the
true.
whole
Why didn't I say
thing.
Nvidia instead of Qualcomm?
But Nvidia's revenues are actually quite a bit smaller, I think, than
Really?
well, they haven't reported their 2024 figures yet, and I've not looked at it on a quarterly basis. But if you go back to 2023, they were not making as much in sales as Intel was.
Oh, actually, before quickly move on, because I just realised I was Googling something. I Googled that Saudi billionaire.
Right.
If you want to look it up, he's called Prince Al-Walid bin Talal.
Okay.
And he's been an investor for ages, and he's the kind of person who, if he rings up anyone, think of any oligarch, if he rings them up, they pick up the phone and they have a proper chat with him. So
Right.
he's actually an incredible source, and obviously he's going to have restraints. He doesn't want to piss off MBS, and he's going to have his own agendas and all that sort of thing. But it's a really interesting interview. So I'll say it one more time: Prince Al-Walid bin Talal.
So, do you know what Nvidia made in revenues in 2023?
Tell me.
It's fiscal 2023, which I think runs to the end of January. So we're talking sort of end January last year. 27 billion. Do you know what Intel makes at the moment? It's
For a full year.
for a full year.
I don't.
It's
200.
billion. No, it's north of 50 billion. But it's fallen from about 77 billion a few years ago. Intel's revenues.
So you telling me that Nvidia's got a 3 trillion market cap on those revenues?
Well, this is the year ago. So
Fucking hell.
it's obviously Nvidia's growth in terms of sales, like year-on-year difference on a quarterly basis has been ridiculous for 2 years,
Yeah.
but not before that. It's really sudden, yeah? It's a spike. This is why people are talking about a bubble, I guess. But, Intel's been on a downward trajectory.
Okay, but just to interrupt, I just Googled NVIDIA revenue breakdown, and I got something that sort of above the fold thing that Google serves up.
All right.
For, I think it says October 2024, so maybe this is Q3 or Q2.
Yeah, well, it's Q3 because its Q4's not out yet.
Yeah, it said 35 billion, which was basically double year on year. That's
in one quarter.
That's revenue for one quarter. I mean, this is just what I'm seeing from a quick Google. I don't know how accurate it all is.
I mean, I very quickly Googled the full year for 2023, and you're looking at quarterly revenues at that time of sort of 6 billion. And as I say, sort of full year results of about 27 billion, but they're going up at some.
Yeah, I don't know if we're talking about different things, Ian, because I just looked at a press release from NVIDIA dated May 22nd last year. It says NVIDIA announces financial results for first quarter fiscal 2025. That annoys me. Fiscal 2025 on May the 22nd, 2024. That's fucking irritating. But anyway,
yeah.
And it says record quarterly revenue of 26 billion.
Yeah, I mean, their revenues have been going up at some ridiculous amount.
But you and I are so far apart that I think we must be talking about different things.
Well,
anyway.
I mean, you want to look up fiscal 2023 full year NVIDIA revenues, if you've got your computer in front of you, and see what they are.
Okay.
But and the point is that their market cap is obviously dramatically out of whack to what
it's very speculative.
To what they're making in terms of, in terms of revenues. But I'd be interested to know what it's showing for the full year in 2023.
Okay, so I've gone fiscal 2023 and then Google served up 24. You presumptuous bastard.
But the 2024 is not out yet, so.
Okay, all right.
Anyway, it's a little bit off topic, but
go on.
Intel, which is what we're talking about, rather than NVIDIA, their revenues are north of 50 billion a year, and they're down from, I think that they were up at sort of 77 billion a few years ago, and I'm trying to relate it to telecom, but obviously Intel's got all sorts of issues at the moment.
Yeah,
it's got multiple problems. It's like the Roman Empire under attack on multiple fronts from the sort of Visigoths and the Vandals and everyone all at the same time. There's all sorts of things going wrong. The one problem is this effort to kind of set up a foundry business, which is very geopolitical, I think, in nature. This is a concern that. To sort of link it to what you were just talking about, that we don't do any chip making now in the West.
And just for people who don't know, that the pertinence of the term foundry in this context is Intel, through most of its history, all of its manufacturing has been for itself.
Yeah.
So what Intel does is basically a manufacturing company.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And it makes chips, and then it finds uses for those chips, and it's been very good at it.
Called fabs.
Yeah, it makes those chips. Been very good at it. It's got Intel that my Dell computer's got Intel vPro sticker on it, all that Intel inside. Yep. It's been really good at all that, and it's been really good at getting its chips.
Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, it's been really good at getting its chips in the machines that are in data centers as well.
Yeah,
but the relevant, and I will shut up in a sec. The relevance of the foundry bit is they decided a few years ago that our manufacturing capacity, it needs to be able to serve third parties rather than just ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's what the foundry model is.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
Which is very, very geopolitical in nature, because there's a concern that most manufacturing is done now by two companies, TSMC and Samsung, at the cutting edge, that is, the kind of most advanced chips. They're both in Asia.
Close to China.
Well, one of them is claimed by China. Obviously, one of them is claimed as a territory by China, and that's the one that happens to be the bigger power.
And in case I'm flying to China, I've got no problem with that. By the way, you can have it.
That's the one that's got the most of the market when it comes to these most advanced chips. So if you're someone like Ericsson or Nokia, and you're designing your in-house chips, or you're getting someone like Marvell, let's say, you're working with them on the design of chips. This is all in the public domain. So those chips would then go to be sort of produced by TSMC. That's the company that makes them. And there's a concern that because of the way the world's going, that we don't have as much manufacturing capacity as we should have in the West, and therefore there's been This is partly responsible for things like the CHIPS Act, this thing that came around under Biden, giving a lot of US subsidies to people like Intel to set up foundries.
Bringing it back to our previous bit, it's not just China that likes to fuck around.
Exactly. But this is obviously put a huge, because I know there's talk about what it receives in as part of the CHIPS Act, but clearly there's a huge amount of capital expenditure within Intel going into setting up their foundry business, and it's just massively consuming resources and attention, and that's one of its issues. The other one is, you were saying that their own chips, the ones they make themselves, I mean, they have been at the heart of computing, basically, ever since computing was a thing.
Yeah,
Since
Moore's law.
Since even before the Windows revolution of the 90s, when they worked very closely with Microsoft on ensuring that the things that go into the laptop that you're looking at the moment would run on Intel processors. They were the original chips company. I mean, if you read Chris Miller's brilliant book Chip War on the history of chips, basically, they're the original guys. They were in a post Second World War period. They're the company that was formed. Intel came out of that. Amazing innovations, and because of that they've become, and they sort of pivot into the world of PCs and data center servers. That's happened, in the last sort of 40-50 years, has made them the kind of default option. Their market share, they still power most PCs.
Well, they created x86. And the only reason AMD exists is because they decided x86 was such a monopoly that at least one other player had to have access to that technology.
So they still, I mean, AMD is seen as, this is actually one of the challenges they've had, is that AMD's been taking market share from them in these areas, in computer chips, PC chips, and in the data center servers. They still have the most market share there, but it's come down a lot in the last few years. And the other problem they have is now a concern about that x86 architecture itself. Is ARM, which is this alternative architecture. We won't go into the specifics because we haven't got enough time. But
in essence, it's more energy inefficient.
Yeah, I mean,
so it's better for phones, but historically not necessarily so good for data centers where you weren't so worried. But that dynamic is changing, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, because basically the world seems to be moving towards ARM on a data center perspective as well. I mean, the big kind of hyperscaler companies which are building their own chips now, they used to be big Intel customers. They still are big Intel customers for central processing units, the kind of stuff that you run your humdrum everyday IT workloads on. Yeah. They are increasingly making their own ARM-based chips using this alternative architecture. Apple is a big one. They were a customer of Intel. They now do their own ARM-based chips for their own computers. Qualcomm's another one that's kind of getting into that market. The other problem they've had, which is more tying in the NVIDIA thing we were talking about, is a shift from data center investments that used to go into CPUs being diverted towards the kind of stuff that NVIDIA is doing. I mean, this is massive. All the spending in data centers at the moment is going on AI chips, and that's an area where Intel
large language model training.
NVIDIA GPUs basically is what it's been, and there are now maybe some alternatives to those emerging, but Intel hasn't really played in that space. The quarterly update that they've talked a lot about these Gaudi chips. I mean, they're not GPUs; they're actually ASICs. But they had this thing called Falcon Shores that they were supposed to be releasing this year, this GPU. It's their response to NVIDIA, basically. That's now been scrapped. This is
Intel.
This is Intel.
Bless them. Intel's been trying to do GPUs for as long as I've been covering.
That was a big takeaway for the mainstream press from the last earnings call that was a few days ago. It was a Falcon Shores, which was their GPU they were going to come out with. Is now an internal project. They're going to work on the next generation after that, which is called Jaguar Shores. That's going to be the thing that they focus on. So it's another one of those delays that we keep hearing with Intel.
It's just Intel has these quixotic things. Back when I was covering it, like 2 jobs ago, when I was at Hexus and I used to cover mobile chips, they had this thing called Moorestown, where they were trying to take on ARM, but with an x86 chip.
Yeah.
And they came out with these prototypes, and obviously they tried to massage the press, and I was friends with some PR people at the time, and they give me their best shot. But then any phone that was based on this Moorestown thing had a battery life of about 2 seconds, and it fucking warmed your, wherever you had it in your pocket, you knew about it, because it got hot.
Yeah.
In other words, the fundamental difference between x86 and ARM, and let's not forget what ARM originally stood for. It was RISC. The R bit was RISC, which is reduced instruction set computing.
Yeah.
I should have said that before I'd had a few beers. And the whole point of it is it's a stripped down, from an architectural point of view, it's a stripped down version. So x86 is relatively inefficient. It has advantages. It's got a lot of grunt. It's like comparing, I don't know, a Japanese hatchback to an American muscle car or something like that. So they keep trying. The reason I went off on that tangent is Intel's got this rich history of just trying to take on other people who are specialist, whether it's ARM when it comes to energy efficient computing or whether it's NVIDIA when it comes to graphics, and trying to take them on, and it always fails. And I just don't know why they bother.
So, by the way, just to sort of jump in on that NVIDIA stuff that we were getting confused about before, I just looked up their actual website and their results. So their financial year runs to the end of February, NVIDIA. And so what they call their 2024 results is February 2024. When they reported February 2024 results, you're right, it's dramatically higher.
Right.
It's 60.9 billion, up the year before from 26.9.
There we go.
So the 26.9 is their 2023.
And this year's just going to be mental.
Yeah, so they are bigger than Intel, obviously, in terms of revenues. But what I was saying is, if you go back 2 years, almost 26.9 was a lot smaller than Intel is now.
Because that's when they were making most of their money from graphics cards.
So Intel was, as I say, is about 77 a few years ago, and like the last count when NVIDIA last published full year results, which is February, the year ending February 2024, they're on 60.9. Up from 26.9. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Oh, and by the way, talking about chip companies trying to get cute and move into adjacent spaces, I remember when NVIDIA tried to get into the mobile chip space. I think it was called Tegra.
Yeah.
And it was shit.
Yeah.
And then they tried to come out with these gaming phones. And it's like, that's not the main reason you have a phone, is it?
Yeah.
Gaming?
I mean,
overheating phones.
Yeah.
So just to go back to the Intel, and it's got a multitude of problems, basically.
Yeah.
And where does telecom come into this? Just to sort of try and relate it to telecom, it's obviously been a big player in the whole kind of baseband chip space, providing silicon for purpose-built, actually. Deployments, as well as what it really wants to do, which is this idea of chips virtualizing RAN. You know, they're
general purpose CPU sort of thing.
Basically encouraging the RAN vendors that in the past would have run their software on custom built chips to pivot to this sort of Xeon family of general purpose processors that come from Intel. And virtualization's been like a big trend in the networks industry for years. And pretty much even now, Intel's the only option. You know, and I think that some of Intel's problems at the moment are one of the reasons that virtualization, when it comes to the radio access network, is not advanced perhaps as quickly as we were expecting it to. You know, I remember going on about this a few years ago, that you don't want to be in a market where there's a monopoly, and you certainly don't want to be in a market where there's a monopoly with a player that's struggling to the extent that Intel is. So Intel's loss last year was 17 billion, I think they lost last fiscal year.
And they got rid of, talking about loss, they got rid of Pat Gelsinger, who's supposed to be there.
Pat Gelsinger quit. They've lost about 23,000. They talked about 15% job cuts, which a lot of the mainstream press had interpreted as you're going to get rid of 15,000 people. Well, their headcount was quite a bit higher than that. So they've actually cut 23,000 jobs.
Fucking mainstream press, they don't know shit.
I mean, I don't know where that came from. Maybe at some point they said it's roughly 15,000 and people just ran with that. But they've actually cut 23,000 jobs in the last 2 years. They were up at about 130, something north of that, and they've cut 23,000 since then. So the network and edge group, which is a very small bit of Intel, that is the bit that would do virtual RAN chips, didn't have an awful last year. It was better than the year before. Its results, it was kind of flattish sales and operating margin up quite a bit, but it looks like it's being broken up. Like the networks part is being sucked back into what they call data center and AI, the DC AI group, and the edge part of it's being sucked into this PC business, basically the sort of stuff that you'd be using now on that Dell computer in front of you, and it makes you wonder what their commitment's going to be to networks. You know, it's a really small market. The whole products market itself only makes about 40 billion in revenues a year. Chips is a bit of that.
The whole of network.
Yeah, and I, the companies that are building roadmaps partly around Intel's products, like Ericsson, for instance, like Samsung, like a lot of the Open RAN companies. Open RAN's often conflated with virtual RAN, but this idea of using general purpose processors
We've
to
been over
host
that.
your software,
I still find them all very confusing.
Open RAN's just basically using different vendors and plugging them together, whereas virtual RAN's actually using general purpose processors.
Right, okay, fair enough.
For the idea of a multi-purpose chip that you can host a RAN on and other stuff as well.
Yeah, which I still find conceptually a little bit confusing, because a RAN for me, I think of those big light grey rectangles at the radios, and I know that's perhaps the antenna that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But I think of a radio as a physical thing. Yeah. It's on the fucking top of a tower. You can see it when you're driving up the A1.
But if you look at the bottom of the tower, there's server equipment that does all the computing. Right, so that's the bit that Intel plays.
I know, and the bit that confuses me is how much of that stuff can be done, which seems to be at the essence of the vRAN thing. Yeah. Is how much of all that shit can be moved onto there. But you've still always got to have that physical bit. You've got to have the radios, haven't you?
You're never going to get rid of the radios, but a lot of the processing happens in the server equipment that's at the bottom. And,
so is that basically what it is a transfer of the processing from the big light grey rectangle down to the bottom of it?
No, the processing is always going to happen in the server equipment. The difference is that the stuff that you're looking at the moment, if you go and look at a mast now, where you've got your radio units at the top and your servers at the bottom, is the servers, they're not really they're dedicated appliances from people like Huawei or Ericsson or Nokia. The vRAN's about replacing those dedicated appliances with their custom ASICs, with servers made by Dell, incorporating chips from Intel.
Are they still at the bottom of the macro, or are they in the cloud?
So that's the key thing. They could be at the bottom of the macro. So the Vodafone deployment that's going on at the moment in the UK with Samsung, where they're using Dell servers and Intel chips running Samsung vRAN software, are, from what I've been told, being left mainly at mast sites. But the dream, I think, of some telcos is to be able to take that and centralise it, put it into edge facilities.
Yeah.
And then you have a very
that's the cloud dream, isn't it?
And then what you do, and this is why you would do it, I think, is that those same servers that are being used
for other shit.
Can be used for other shit. That's vRAN.
That's the GP. That's the general purpose part of it.
Yes, because it has to be a general purpose processor to be able to do other workloads as well.
And this takes me back to when I was first trying to.
The difference, just to your Open RAN thing.
Interrupted.
The Open RAN difference is who does the software that runs in those appliances or servers, and who does the radio units on top of the mast site. In a traditional RAN, it'd be the same company. In Open RAN, you can have your radio units provided by somebody else and a different, but it could still be purpose built. Yeah, it could still be an appliance from a Samsung. Yeah, with a radio from Mavenir, let's say.
Yeah. So the thing that I just was interrupting with you with earlier was when I was first trying to get my head around the cloud. It must have been like 20 years ago. Because I'm not very good at abstract reasoning. If I can picture it and I can see it, it's a bit like what I was just saying now. I can picture a radio and I can say to my family, if they're unfortunate enough to be in the car with me, and I'm taking my eye off the road and pointing it, because I am a bit sad in that way. I go, look, that's what I fucking write about. That's what pays the bills.
Yeah.
I can picture that, but then when it gets virtual and it gets abstract, I sometimes struggle to get my head around it. And when I was first understanding the cloud, what I really understood was, like, you've got a server, like a rack or whatever, and you've got all these silicon and components and power and bits and bobs
it's a data
working
center,
away.
Basically.
Yeah, but the economics of it is, if you've got a dedicated appliance, there'll be sometimes when it's down, when it's doing fuck all.
Yeah.
And the economics of the cloud computing, as I understood it 15, 20 years ago, is if you've got stuff that's working at maximum capacity all the time. And the only way you can do that is if it's dedicated to multiple jobs. And then when one job doesn't need it, the other job does.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it.
Yeah, and so that's how I understood it.
It's shared resources, like the public clouds, those big data hyperscaler facilities are obviously hosting loads of workloads, but also loads of companies. That's the difference between public and private, is that
and they've got clever software that manages the workload.
Yeah.
And that's where people like AWS have been so incredibly effective.
Then the question is, to your point about the equipment's out of the mast site, is this idea of RAN centralization really going to
pay off in this context?
To pay off, because if you take for a start, there might be if you take the server equipment or the appliances, and let's say you virtualize it and you replace it with a Dell server that's using a Xeon processor, and you've reached that stage, but then you want to do some centralization. Because if you don't do the centralization, it's very unlikely that you actually be using that server equipment for anything else anyway. Yeah. You move it into an edge facility where you might be hosting other workloads, and then you've got the opportunity to do it. But that requires a huge investment then in fiber connectivity between the mast site and the data center. Yeah. So you've already introduced a huge capex job to connect those data centers to the mast site.
Yeah.
And maybe operators. I mean, it might be in a market like Japan where there's a lot of fiber in the ground, but an operator might be looking at this going, well, what's the benefit of doing that really? Are the servers that are being sold for vRAN, which increasingly, and we've gone over this topic of acceleration before quite a bit, are they really general purpose processors, or do they incorporate so much?
It's back to like the look-aside
customization that it's not the sort of thing that Walmart's going to be using. They'd not be using something like that. So it's not really a general purpose server anyway. It's actually quite customized.
Yeah.
So you get into all these different
and then it comes back to the business model of Intel, which is the business model of Intel is just to produce a shitload of silicon and find uses for it.
Yeah, I mean, to tie it back to Intel, because we've gone off on a bit of a sort of vRAN, Open RAN tangent, but clearly vRAN's not really developed very quickly over the last couple of years, and I don't think that's just to do with Intel problems necessarily. I think what we've just been talking about now is probably a bigger reason for vRAN not taking off, rather than Intel being the only supplier. But Intel is the only supplier. All this talk about AMD could be a potential alternative in vRAN, ARM-based, right? There's no evidence. I mean, I was chatting to our colleague Gabriel Brown at Heavy Reading, and he was saying on a call earlier this week that Intel pretty much is the only vRAN option.
Yeah.
And you look at Intel's numbers,
and they're on shaky ground.
They're on shaky ground, so that's automatically then going to make people nervous. The whole AI RAN thing, which is a part of the story I wrote this week, I think has thrown additional confusion into the mix, and is probably now making people think, where do we put our resources?
So your headline, I assume this is the one you're referring to. Your headline is Intel and telcos left in virtual RAN limbo by rise of AI RAN.
Yeah, exactly.
What was that noise, Pierre? Get the fuck on with that noise.
No, well, I have sinus infection.
Oh, okay.
He's not well.
But wait, that's also kind of...
It was.
We're approaching 2 hours.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so let's wrap up the Intel thing, and I'll be very quick on the last one.
I think the AI RAN, which is this idea that pretty much NVIDIA's coined that phrase, I think is a kind of rescoping of virtual and open RAN, that you can run some of your telco workloads on a general purpose processor, which in NVIDIA's case would be an ARM-based processor, yeah? They would be using a Grace CPU, which is ARM, and then the whizzier stuff, the more complicated RAN stuff, you put on a GPU, and the excess capacity on that GPU you lease out for inference at the edge.
Right.
That's the use case. That's the AI. That's the basic AI RAN story.
Okay.
And I think, we don't really know where it's going to go, but I think what it's done is it's made people think there's so many options now on chips. You've got purpose-built chips. You've got this Intel vRAN story. You've got ARM-based alternatives like NVIDIA and Graviton from AWS. You've got the notion of using GPUs to accelerate, but also to host AI workloads.
Yep.
Maybe the end result of all this is that nothing happens and people just stick with their purpose-built suppliers.
Yeah, I think there's a term for that where it's like you get paralysed by choice.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. People are paralysed by choice.
It's like going into Starbucks and going, "Oh, just give me a fucking coffee."
Yeah, because people aren't convinced by the NVIDIA story. Those chips are obviously incredibly power hungry, and we don't really know how that's going to play out. But it's almost at the moment I think operators. If I was an operator and you're not making that much money, you are making a lot of money, but you're not growing sales. You've got capex challenges, and you're looking at what's going on. You're thinking, where do I jump?
Fair enough. Okay, final segment. It's good that we left this till last because this is a segment where, I mean, I've realised, for people listening, the structure of this podcast has evolved very organically, and we know that the first segment we do is when we're most self-indulgent when it comes to tangents and exploring things deeply, and then we get under time pressure, and then the last one is just ridiculously condensed. And if I was more organised and we were more structured collectively, we'd have hard cut-offs, but we don't, do we? And this last one, we could have, if we'd done this as a first segment, we could have just spent 2 hours plus just banging on about it.
Just so you know, our presence is being requested elsewhere.
Oh, we're being prodded, are we?
Yes.
Tell them
See? It's not even me.
Tell them 20 minutes or something.
Right.
We'll say who we're going. We're going to go hang out with Babel, PR, and we're also going to hang out with someone who used to work at Babel who still works in PR, who's a good friend of ours called Katie Finn. Hello. It's going to be a weird time warp because they'll see this on Monday when we've already gone out and got pissed with them. Anyway, so I'll keep it quick, seeing as they're already chasing us up. I wrote a story where the headline was, "If you don't like Google's AI principles, well, it has others." And in case people didn't get what the reference was, I actually spent $4 of Informer's money on a photo of Groucho Marx holding a guitar in his classic Groucho Marx pose. And the reason I went for Groucho Marx is because it's his quote that I was paraphrasing. His precise quote was, "Those are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have others." And the reason I like that quote is because principles are not supposed to be malleable, and they're not supposed to be opportunistic. They're they're supposed to be set in stone, but obviously some things are a bit subject to conditions. But if you have a principle, it should just be there. There's a difference between a principle and an ideal. An ideal is where everything is valid in service of the ideal. The ends justify the means. A principle should mean that, like, no, I will never do this no matter what circumstances are. Like for us journalists, a principle we should have is that we will never knowingly lie in a story. That should be a principle. And as soon as we break that, why should anyone listen to anything we write? If we've got even one instance of lying in what we write, then we can't be trusted anymore.
Yeah.
And the reason this came up is because there was a blog post from Google about responsible AI, and it was like blah blah blah. A lot of this sort of verbiage and philosophizing about doing the right thing. But I wasn't the first to spot it. I think maybe Bloomberg was the first to spot it. But basically, Google, of all companies, have always had this thing where they've wanted to go along with these infantile statements of sort of altruistic principle, like don't do evil or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, for fuck's sake.
That was their slogan,
stupid thing to say.
Yeah.
Don't do evil.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a stupid thing to say morally, but it's a stupid thing to say practically, like define evil and do and everything. And back in 2018, they first published their principles of proper AI, and it seemed to be prompted by their involvement in a thing called Project Maven, which was a project with the American Department of Defense, where they were helping them. They were using AI to identify baddies in the battlefield and fucking blow them up. And these
it's not a slippery slope at all.
Do you know what I mean? And these tech companies, they have quite a lot of right-on sort of touchy-feely lefty employees because they're all Silicon Valley, all San Francisco and shit. And these employees all revolted. They're like, "No, we're not happy with this at all. I thought we did no evil, and now we're suddenly collaborating over weapons." And so they shat themselves and went, yeah, we won't do that anymore. And then at the same time, they published this thing to say all these things they wouldn't do. And one of the things they wouldn't do was they wouldn't get involved with weapons.
Right.
Officially. Yeah, well, go. And anyway, 6 years later, they've revised their principles. And
there's a lot of money in weapons,
yeah,
actually.
and obviously, while they didn't explicitly go, no, we're really into weapons now. They did just
We're all about the weapons.
We love weapons.
we fucking love a weapon. Missiles give us no, because there's something crude, but I won't.
I know what you were going to say.
But basically, they just sort of memory hold all that stuff, and they just went, no, we're all about responsible development and deployment, but it's typically vague, platitudinous. You know, we just want to do the right thing, but not actually committing themselves to specifics like they had done 6 years previously. And this was spotted, and a few people, and I think even went as far as the BBC, they all noticed it, and they're like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
And that's why I made the point, and that's why I invoked the Groucho Marx thing, is, you know, just to sum it up, I mean, maybe I'll read my final paragraph. And I'll read my final two. I'll be self-indulgent. So my penultimate paragraph, I said, Google has a long history of committing itself to malleable virtue signalling platitudes, i.e. the don't do evil. And its 2018 vows always seemed unlikely to stand the test of time. This tweet coincides with a significant escalation in the AI arms race following the revelation of China's rapid process in the field, and that's a link to a DeepSeek thing.
Yeah.
Google presumably doesn't want to miss out on the zillions of dollars of taxpayer money destined to be thrown to the matter, and the zillions of dollars I hyperlinked to the Stargate thing.
Apparently that Sam Altman now wants a Stargate for Europe.
Right, Stargate 2.
Stargate 2, Europe could have a Stargate as well, is the Bloomberg headline from something.
I'll say, you can say what you want about Sam Altman. He doesn't lack ambition.
So the AI voice can have a French or English accent?
Yeah, and why not throw a trillion at that or something?
I'll tell you what.
Rather than, and be more ambitious.
Don't give the AI a French accent. Everyone will just do what they're told. It will just come up and go, how about you do this little thing? And people go, yeah, all right. Except French people. French people will be the only ones who are immune.
Give it a German accent, then no one will do what they're told.
Exactly.
I think
That's
it's
a terrible thing
the
to say.
opposite, but yeah.
No, I'll tell you, Pierre, you must know how the whole rest of the world thinks French is just the coolest, most seductive accent.
I don't hear it as a authoritative.
I don't want
No, I think it's
that's
seductive,
the
not
reason.
authoritative.
You don't want authoritative, otherwise you won't
yeah.
do it. I want Catherine Deneuve speaking to me.
Don't get me started, mate. Anyway, so that was my penultimate paragraph. And then my final paragraph is, I said, as Groucho Marx is famously quoted as saying, those are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have others. It's arguably impossible for companies to have any principles at all other than the pursuit of their own interests. And it's an insult to our intelligence when they claim otherwise, which I firmly believe. All this sort of corporate virtue signaling is all bollocks.
Yeah. Well, it's gone now, hasn't it?
Well, Trump signed a thing, didn't he, where he said you can't do it anymore.
You're not allowed to do corporate virtue signalling, and even in the UK, we've seen companies that we know very well and cover regularly moving away from some
Yes,
of that.
indeed. Some of them might even be telecoms companies.
Yes.
Although not necessarily moving away.
No, that's true.
Anyway. And then my final sentence, which I've noticed there isn't a full stop. So the end of my whole story doesn't have a full stop. Well, this is a relatively obscure...
But that was intentional, though.
In my defence, everyone, I basically... No one proofs my stuff. I mean, Andrew does when he's around, but he's been off.
At least you didn't say Huawei was the 9th biggest company rather than the 10th.
We don't really have a copy editing process at Telecoms.com. I write it and I whack it up on the site, and that's how it works. Anyway, and so my final sentence is, while this is a relatively obscure tweak by one company, referring back to the Google change of principles, it calls into question all other statements of AI principles and bodes ill for the future direction of AI in general. And that last clause was the one that we could have just spent an hour banging on about in a sort of Terminator-y way.
Yeah.
But we're not going to, because we've got people waiting for us to get the pub.
Yeah.
So are you all right if I just wrap it up there?
Yeah, let's wrap it up.
Okay, that was fun. I mean, I have learned that sometimes those ones that are so open-ended, it's probably best to leave them till late, where we've just got no choice but to condense them.
Yeah, well, no one will remember it in the long run anyway.
I wonder how many people make it right to the end of the pod.
All these moments will be lost in time like tears in rain.
Which, as we all know from social media this week, was ad-libbed by Rutger Hauer in Blade Runner. Okay, all right, I will stop there. We do have a guest next week. I'm trying to remember who it is. Oh yeah, I
say
know who
it.
it is.
You never say it.
No, I do, but we do have one, hopefully,
Yeah.
unless they bail, like this week's one. So thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for that one.